Grace Whitmore's trembling hands held her dying infant as the merciless Texas sun beat down on her crumbling homestead. No milk, no hope, no husband. Murdered by rustlers 3 weeks past. She'd already chosen which dress to bury her baby in when hoofbeats shattered the silence of Cedar Creek. A stranger appeared through the dust, leading a milk cow heavy with salvation, but his eyes held secrets darker than the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. This is their story, a tale of desperation, redemption, and love born from ashes. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The dust devils danced across the parched earth of Cedar Creek like demons mocking the dead. Grace Whitmore sat motionless on her weathered porch, the wood beneath her so dry it no longer even creaked, just crumbled, same as everything else in her life. In her arms, baby Clara lay frighteningly still, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular rhythms that made Grace's heart clench with each uncertain breath. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since they'd buried Thomas. Grace pressed her cracked lips together, refusing to cry. She'd run out of tears days ago, just like she'd run out of everything else. Water from the well had dropped to a brackish trickle. The vegetable garden had withered to brown stalks that snapped like old bones. The chickens had stopped laying, then stopped moving altogether. And her milk, the milk that should have been flowing to keep her daughter alive, had dried up 2 days after the funeral, as if her body knew there was no point in fighting anymore. The late afternoon sun hammered down with the weight of God's judgment, turning the Texas plains into a shimmering hell. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, the only living thing besides Grace and Clara that seemed willing to acknowledge this God-forsaken stretch of land still existed. Grace looked down at her daughter's face, 5 months old. Clara's cheeks, once plump and pink, had hollowed into something that looked like a porcelain doll someone had left out in the rain. Her lips were pale, her skin papery. When she did cry, which was less and less often now, it came out as a weak mewling that broke what remained of Grace's heart into ever smaller pieces. "I'm sorry, baby girl," Grace whispered, her voice rough from disuse and dehydration. "I'm so sorry." She'd tried everything. She'd walked the 3 miles to the Hendersons' place, only to find it abandoned, a crude sign nailed to the door. "Gone to Kansas. God help Texas." She'd attempted to make a thin gruel from the last of the flour, but Clara couldn't keep it down. She'd even, Lord forgive her, tried to feed the baby water mixed with a few drops of whiskey from Thomas's hidden bottle, hoping it might at least help her sleep through the hunger. It hadn't worked. The town of Cedar Creek was 6 miles east, but it might as well have been 600. Grace's horse had been stolen the same night Thomas was killed, along with their 3 cows and the old mule. The rustlers had taken everything of value and left her with nothing but a corpse, a baby, and a drought that showed no sign of breaking. She'd thought about walking to town, carrying Clara, but 6 miles in this heat, without water, with no guarantee anyone there could help anyway? The drought had turned neighbor against neighbor, everyone hoarding what little they had. Grace had heard stories of families abandoning their homesteads in the dead of night, leaving everything behind rather than watch their children starve slowly. Maybe that would be kinder, she thought, then immediately hated herself for it. Mrs. Whitmore was a good woman, they'd say at her funeral, if anyone even found their bodies before the coyotes did. Died trying to save her baby. Tragic thing, that. She wondered if anyone in town even remembered she was out here. Thomas had always been the one to ride in for supplies, to socialize, to make their presence known. Grace had been content to stay on their little homestead, tending her garden and her baby, living the quiet life she'd always dreamed of. Now that dream had curdled into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Clara stirred in her arms, making a sound like a kitten. Grace tried to rock her, but the movement felt mechanical, hollow. What comfort could she offer when comfort itself had abandoned them? "Once upon a time," Grace heard herself saying, her voice cracking, "there was a little girl who lived in a house made of sunshine." She'd been telling Clara stories since the day she was born. Fairy tales about princesses and happy endings, about good triumphing over evil, about love conquering all. Thomas used to tease her about it. "Baby can't understand a word you're saying," he'd laugh, his eyes crinkling at the corners the way she'd loved. "She will someday," Grace would reply. And when she does, she'll know the world can be beautiful. But the world wasn't beautiful. The world was cruel and savage, and it took away everything you loved and left you with nothing but dust and death. And Grace stopped herself, took a shuddering breath. She wouldn't think like that. Couldn't. The moment she gave up hope entirely was the moment she might as well lay down and let the desert take them both. She looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent toward evening. The sky had taken on that particular quality of light that happened in late summer, golden and harsh, and somehow both beautiful and terrible at the same time. Heat waves made the distant landscape shimmer like a mirage. And that's when she saw it. At first, Grace thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, that dehydration had finally pushed her mind over the edge into hallucination. But she blinked, squinted, and the vision remained. A figure on horseback, moving slowly toward her homestead through the wavering heat. Her heart began to pound. Riders meant danger more often than not these days. The men who'd killed Thomas had been riders. Rustlers, outlaws, deserters from the war that had ended 10 years ago, but left its damage scattered across the frontier like shrapnel. They all rode horses, and they all meant trouble for a woman alone. Grace stood on shaking legs, instinctively moving back toward her door. The rifle was inside, Thomas's rifle, though she wasn't sure she had the strength to lift it, let alone fire it with any accuracy. And even if she could, she had exactly 3 bullets left. But as the rider drew closer, Grace's fear began to mix with something else, a desperate, wild hope that made her chest tight. Because behind the rider, connected by a lead rope, walked a cow, a milk cow. Grace's vision blurred with sudden tears. She clutched Clara tighter, afraid to believe what she was seeing, terrified it would dissolve into nothing but another cruel trick of the dying light. The rider kept coming, steady and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. As the distance closed, Grace could make out more details. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, sitting easy in his saddle like someone who'd been born on horseback. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun, a faded blue shirt, and dark pants tucked into worn boots. A bedroll was tied behind his saddle, saddlebags hanging on either side. A drifter, then. Or a cowboy between jobs. Either way, not someone who belonged to Cedar Creek. The cow behind him was a dusty brown color, moving with the placid steadiness of her kind. And unless Grace's desperate mind was inventing details that weren't there, the cow's udder looked full. The rider stopped about 20 feet from the porch. For a long moment, he simply sat there, and Grace got the impression he was taking in the scene before him. The crumbling homestead, the dead garden, the gaunt woman with the dying baby clutched to her chest. Then he dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. And for the first time, Grace got a clear look at his face. He was younger than she'd expected. Maybe 30, perhaps a few years older. His hair was the color of sun-bleached wheat, curling slightly at the edges where it escaped his hat. His face was weathered and tanned, with the kind of lines that came from squinting into too many sunrises and sunsets. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray-blue, like the sky before a storm, with a depth that suggested he'd seen things that had marked him in ways both visible and not. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that felt almost foreign after weeks of isolation. His voice was deep, quiet, with the slight drawl of someone who'd spent time in both Texas and territories farther north. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her throat had closed up, whether from disuse or emotion, she couldn't tell. The stranger seemed to understand. He glanced at the baby in her arms, and something shifted in his expression, a tightening around his eyes, a set to his jaw that spoke of recognition. He knew what he was looking at. He'd seen starvation before. "Name's Luke Carver," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse. "I've been riding through, looking for work, but I can see—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I can see you might need help more than you need a hired hand." Grace finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "We don't have any money." "Didn't ask for money," Luke replied. He gestured to the cow behind him. "This here's Bessie. She's a good milker, steady temperament. Hasn't been able to drink much the last few days, water's scarce on the trail, but she's got milk to spare." Grace's arms tightened around Clara. "Why?" The word came out sharper than she'd intended. edged with suspicion born of too many hard lessons. Why would you help us? Luke was quiet for a moment, his storm-gray eyes fixed on something in the middle distance. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Grace understand this man knew about loss. Had a sister once, he said, younger than me by 10 years. Our parents died of cholera when I was 16, left me to take care of her on our homestead in Colorado. I tried my best, but... He paused, jaw working. Drought came, just like here. Crops failed. I couldn't produce enough food to keep us both alive. By the time I admitted defeat and decided to take her to town, it was too late. She was 6 years old. The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through dead grass. I've been drifting ever since, Luke continued. 15 years now. Can't seem to settle anywhere. Can't seem to stop moving. But every now and then I come across someone who needs help, really needs it, life or death. And I figure maybe that's why I'm still here. Maybe I couldn't save her, but I can save someone else. He looked directly at Grace then, and she saw no pity in his eyes, only a kind of fierce determination that made her believe he meant every word. So I'm not asking for money, ma'am. I'm asking if you'll let me help. Let me give you some milk for your baby. Let me stay a few days, help you get back on your feet, repair what needs repairing, teach you how to care for the cow if you don't already know. Then I'll move on, same as always. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her rib cage. Every instinct screamed that she should be cautious, that inviting a strange man onto her property when she was alone and vulnerable was foolish at best, deadly at worst. But Clara made another weak sound, and Grace looked down at her daughter's face. So pale, so fragile, so close to slipping away, and she knew she didn't have a choice. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "All right," she whispered. Then louder, "All right, yes, please." Luke nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "First things first, then. Let's get some milk into that baby." He moved with efficient purpose, tying his horse and the cow to the hitching post that Thomas had built when they'd first arrived at this homestead 4 years ago, back when everything had been new and full of promise. Luke pulled a tin cup from his saddlebag, then approached the cow, speaking to her in low, soothing tones as he positioned the cup and began to milk her. Grace watched, transfixed. The sound of milk hitting the bottom of the tin cup was like music, liquid and rich and real. She'd almost forgotten what fresh milk looked like, the way it caught the light, the slight foam at the top. Within minutes, Luke had filled the cup halfway. He stood, careful not to spill a drop, and carried it to the porch. Up close, Grace could see more details, the way his hands were calloused and scarred, the kind of hands that knew hard work, the way he moved with a kind of deliberate care that suggested he'd learned to be gentle in a world that often wasn't. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the baby. Grace hesitated only a moment before shifting Clara in her arms, angling her so Luke could bring the cup closer. Her hands were shaking so badly she wasn't sure she could have held it steady anyway. Luke crouched down to their level, bringing himself to their height rather than looming over them. He tilted the cup carefully, letting just a few drops of milk touch Clara's pale lips. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Clara's mouth opened reflexively, her tongue reaching for the moisture. Luke let a few more drops fall, and this time Clara made a small sound. Not quite a cry, but something more alive than anything Grace had heard from her in days. "That's it," Luke murmured. "There you go, little one. Slow now, slow." He fed Clara drop by drop, patient as stone, never rushing, always watching for signs that she might choke or struggle. And slowly, impossibly, Clara began to drink. Small sips at first, then longer pulls. Her tiny hands, which had been lying limp, suddenly reached up, grasping at air, at Grace's dress, at life itself. Grace couldn't stop the sob that tore from her throat. Tears she thought she'd run out of came flooding back, streaming down her face as she watched her daughter drink, watched color begin to return to those pale cheeks, watched life reassert itself against all odds. "Thank you," she gasped. "Oh God, thank you, thank you. No thanks needed," Luke said quietly, his attention still focused on Clara. "Every child deserves a fighting chance." They stayed like that until Clara had drunk nearly half the cup, more than Grace would have dared hope for. Then the baby's eyes began to flutter, her body relaxing into something that looked like actual sleep. rather than the terrible unconscious state she'd been drifting in and out of. Luke carefully withdrew the cup and stood, backing away to give Grace space. "She'll need more in a few hours," he said. "Little and often. That's the key when they've been without for a while. Too much too fast and she'll just bring it back up." Grace nodded, unable to speak, cradling Clara against her chest and feeling the steady rise and fall of her daughter's breathing, stronger now, more regular. The relief was so intense it was almost painful, like blood returning to a limb that had gone numb. "When did you last eat?" Luke asked. "Femme duck." The question caught Grace off guard. She had to think about it. Yesterday? Day before?" Time had become slippery, meaningless. "There's some flour left, I think. Maybe enough for—" "I've got supplies," Luke interrupted gently. "Trail rations, dried beef, beans, coffee. Nothing fancy, but it'll do. Why don't you go inside with the baby? Let her rest proper. I'll see to the animals, then fix us something to eat." Grace wanted to protest, wanted to say she could manage, wanted to maintain some shred of the independence and capability she'd always prided herself on. But her legs were trembling, her head was swimming, and Clara was finally sleeping peacefully in her arms. "The barn," she said instead. It's mostly intact. There's space for the horses and the cow, and there's a pump out back, though the water's low." "I'll manage," Luke assured her. "You just take care of that little one." Grace turned toward the door, then paused. "Mr. Carver?" "Luke's fine, ma'am." Luke. The name felt strange on her tongue, too familiar, too intimate for a man she'd known for less than an hour. But nothing about this situation was normal anyway. Why milk? I mean, you could have brought water or food, or why specifically a cow? Luke was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his voice carried that same weight of old grief. "Because," he said, "when my sister was dying, what she needed most, what would have saved her if I'd had it, was milk. Fresh, rich, full of everything a body needs to survive. I swore then that if I ever had the means, I'd never let another child die for lack of it. I bought Bessie 3 months ago, been traveling with her since. When I saw your homestead from the ridge this morning, saw the state of things." He trailed off, then finished simply, "Figured you might need her more than I do." Grace felt something shift in her chest, some small piece of the armor she'd built around her heart these past terrible weeks cracking open. "I don't know how to repay—" "Don't need repayment," Luke cut in, but his voice was kind. "Just need to know I did something right for once. That's payment enough." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak again without breaking down entirely. She went inside, leaving the door open behind her, a gesture of trust that surprised her even as she made it. The interior of the house was dim and stuffy after the brightness outside. Grace made her way to the bedroom she'd shared with Thomas, carefully laying Clara in the cradle he'd built with his own hands during the long winter before she was born. The baby stirred but didn't wake, and Grace stood there for a long moment, just watching her daughter breathe. She was still standing there when she heard sounds from outside. The clop of hooves as Luke led the animals to the barn, the creak of leather and jingle of tack being removed, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to Bessie and his horse. Normal sounds. Sounds of life continuing, of work being done, of the world turning as it should. Sounds she'd thought she might never hear again. Grace moved to the window, peering out through the dusty glass. She could see Luke moving between the barn and the pump, hauling water for the animals with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from years of hard labor. His movements were economical, nothing wasted, nothing hurried. He'd taken off his hat, and his wheat-colored hair caught the late afternoon light. Thomas had been dark-haired with brown eyes that sparkled when he laughed. He'd been shorter, stockier, with a loud voice and an easy manner that drew people to him. Luke was his opposite in almost every way, tall, lean, quiet, with eyes that suggested storm clouds and deep waters. Grace felt a sudden, unexpected pang of guilt. What would Thomas think of her, accepting help from a strange man, letting him stay on their property, trusting him so quickly? Thomas had always been protective, sometimes too much so. He wouldn't have liked this situation at all. But Thomas was dead, killed by men he'd tried to negotiate with, men who'd taken everything and left Grace alone to face impossible choices. And Luke Carver, whatever else he might be, had just saved Clara's life. That had to count for something. Grace forced herself to move, to do something productive, rather than stand at the window watching a stranger work. The house was a disaster. She could see that now with fresh eyes, as if Luke's arrival had somehow given her back the ability to notice her surroundings. Dust covered everything. Dishes sat unwashed in the basin. The floor was gritty with tracked-in dirt. Her dress, the same one she'd been wearing for at least 4 days, was stained and wrinkled. She set about tidying with what little energy she had left, gathering the dishes, sweeping the floor, trying to restore some semblance of order to the chaos her life had become. It felt good to move, to have purpose again beyond simply surviving one more hour. By the time Luke knocked on the doorframe, respectful, not presuming to just enter, Grace had managed to make the main room look almost presentable. Clara was still sleeping peacefully, and Grace herself had changed into a cleaner dress, though she'd long since given up on the niceties of propriety. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she'd washed her face and hands with some of the precious water from the kitchen pitcher. "Don't mean to intrude," Luke said from the doorway, "but I've got some beans cooked if you're hungry." Grace realized suddenly that she was ravenous. "I'll come out," she said. "Let me just check on Clara." The baby was still sleeping, her chest rising and falling with blessed regularity. Grace whispered a prayer of thanks, then joined Luke on the porch. He'd set up a small camp setup just off to the side. A fire ring with rocks pulled from somewhere, a cooking pot suspended over flames, 2 tin plates and cups waiting on a flat rock. The smell of cooking beans and coffee hit Grace like a physical force, making her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. "Sit," Luke said, gesturing to a relatively stable section of the porch. "I'll bring you a plate." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to serve herself, wanted to maintain some shred of her role as the woman of the house. But her legs were shaking again, so she sat. Luke filled a plate with beans, added a piece of dried beef, and brought it to her along with a cup of coffee, so strong she could almost smell the caffeine. Their fingers brushed as he handed over the plate, and Grace was startled by how warm his hands were. "Thank you," she murmured. Luke just nodded and went to get his own plate. They ate in silence for several minutes, Grace shoveling food into her mouth with an urgency that probably looked undignified, but she was beyond caring. The beans were simple, nothing fancy, but they were hot and filling and real. "This is good," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Really good." Luke gave a slight smile. "Cowboy beans. Learn to make them decent or starve on the trail. Not much middle ground." "How long have you been drifting?" Grace asked, surprising herself with the question. 15 years, like I said, since I was 16. Luke stared into his coffee cup. Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, Kansas, Nebraska. I've worked ranches all over. Never more than a few months in one place. Something always pulls me on. That must be lonely. Sometimes, he admitted. Other times it's a relief. No attachments means no one to lose. Grace thought about that. But also no one to share anything with. True enough. Luke looked at her then, really looked at her, and Grace felt exposed under that storm-gray gaze. "What about you? How'd you end up out here?" Grace set down her empty plate. She'd cleaned it faster than she'd thought possible. "Thomas and I came out 4 years ago. We were from Missouri originally, but he wanted land of his own, wanted to build something that was ours. This place was available, cheap because of the drought cycles, but Thomas said we could make it work. And we did, for a while. We had a garden, some chickens, 3 cows, made enough to get by. Then," she swallowed hard. 3 weeks ago, rustlers came. Thomas went out to talk to them, tried to negotiate. They shot him, took the animals, left me with Clara and nothing else. "I'm sorry," Luke said quietly, and the way he said it made Grace believe he truly meant it. The drought got worse after that, like God decided we hadn't suffered enough already. Grace laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "My milk dried up, the garden died. I didn't know what to do." "You survived," Luke said firmly. "That's what you did. You kept yourself and your daughter alive until help could arrive. That takes strength most people don't have." Grace felt tears threatening again. "I was about to give up. Today. If you hadn't come—" "But I did come," Luke interrupted gently. "And tomorrow's a new day. Sometimes that's all we need. One more day, one more chance. They sat in companionable silence as the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for such a harsh landscape. Grace felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the possibility of hope. The shadow of hope. "Your husband," Luke said after a while. "Where is he buried?" Grace gestured toward a spot about 100 yards from the house, where a simple wooden cross marked the grave she'd dug by herself, crying with every shovelful of earth. "There. I did the best I could." Luke nodded. "I'll pay my respects tomorrow, if that's all right with you." "You don't have to." "I know, but I'd like to." Grace didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Inside the house, Clara began to whimper, a sound that would have terrified Grace an hour ago but now seemed merely normal, the healthy fussing of a baby waking up hungry. "That's my cue," she said, standing. "I'll get more milk ready," Luke offered. They fell into a rhythm then, one that felt both strange and natural. Luke milked Bessie again while Grace changed Clara's diaper and rocked her. Then they met back on the porch, and Luke patiently fed the baby more milk, a little at a time, while Grace watched with her heart in her throat. Clara drank more this time, her small hands grasping at the cup with more strength. When she'd had her fill, Grace burped her and was rewarded with the most normal, mundane baby sound, a little burp followed by what might have been the start of a smile. Grace burst into tears again. Luke, to his credit, didn't comment on it. He just quietly gathered up the dishes and carried them toward the pump to wash them, giving Grace privacy for her breakdown. By the time he returned, Grace had pulled herself together. The sun had set fully now, and stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. So many stars, like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Without the light pollution of cities, the frontier night sky was something to behold. "I'll bed down in the barn," Luke said. "Be out of your way." "You could," Grace started, then stopped herself. What had she been about to say? That he could sleep in the house? That was improper, even dangerous. She didn't know this man. "The barn is fine," she finished lamely. Luke smiled slightly, as if he knew exactly what she'd been thinking. "Barn's more than fine. I've slept in worse places. You and the baby get some rest. I'll be around if you need anything. Just call out." He tipped his hat to her and walked away, disappearing into the darkness toward the barn. Grace watched him go, feeling a confusing mix of relief and disappointment. Inside, she prepared for bed with Clara, laying down on the mattress she'd shared with Thomas. The baby, full and content for the first time in days, settled immediately into deep sleep. Grace lay awake longer, staring at the ceiling, listening to the night sounds outside. For the first time in 3 weeks, she didn't cry herself to sleep. And just before she drifted off, she heard something she'd almost forgotten existed, the distant rumble of thunder on the horizon. The next morning, Grace woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of rain. Rain. She sat bolt upright, hardly daring to believe it. But there it was, the soft patter of water on the roof, the musical sound of it hitting the dry earth, the cool breeze coming through the window carrying the scent of moisture and promise. Grace scrambled out of bed, checking Clara first. The baby was still sleeping peacefully, then rushing to the window. Outside, the world had transformed overnight. The sky was heavy with clouds, and gentle rain fell steadily, turning the dust to mud, filling the empty channels that had forgotten what water felt like. On the porch, Luke stood with his face turned up to the sky, arms spread wide, letting the rain soak him. He looked like a man who'd been wandering in a desert and had finally found an oasis. Grace grabbed a shawl, threw it over her nightgown, and hurried outside. The moment the rain hit her face, she started laughing, really laughing, deep and full and joyous. She'd forgotten what rain felt like, forgotten how it could make everything new again. Luke turned to her, grinning, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and somehow lighter. "Looks like someone's looking out for you," he said. "For us," Grace corrected, and was surprised to realize she meant it. They stood there together, two strangers brought together by desperation and circumstance, watching the rain wash away weeks of dust and despair, and Grace thought, just maybe, that Luke Carver had brought them more than milk. He'd brought them a chance to live again. The rain continued through the morning, steady and gentle, as if the sky itself was apologizing for its long absence. Grace stood at her kitchen window, watching Luke work in the drizzle, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite trust yet, but the beginning of it, like a seed just starting to crack open underground. He'd been true to his word. After the initial joy of the rainfall had subsided, Luke had set about repairing the roof, climbing up with boards he'd found in the barn and nails from his saddlebag. Grace had protested at first, saying she couldn't ask him to do so much, but he'd simply looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said, "You didn't ask. I'm offering." Now, as she nursed Clara, the baby finally strong enough to latch properly after 2 more feedings of Bessie's milk, Grace watched Luke move across the roofline with the sure-footedness of someone who'd spent half his life working at heights. His shirt was soaked through, clinging to broad shoulders and a lean frame that spoke of hard work and harder miles. "You're staring, Grace," she muttered to herself, turning away from the window with a flush of embarrassment that she was grateful no one could see. It had been so long since she'd had another adult in her space, she'd forgotten how to act around people. Thomas had been gone nearly a month now, but it felt like longer, like she'd lived several lifetimes in those weeks of isolation and desperation. The woman who'd waved goodbye to her husband that morning, never imagining it would be the last time, felt like a stranger now. That Grace had been softer, more naive, still believing the world would be fair if you just worked hard enough. This Grace knew better. Clara finished nursing and Grace burped her gently, marveling at how much stronger her daughter felt already. The baby's eyes were brighter, her skin had color again, and when she looked up at Grace, there was recognition there, awareness that had been fading just yesterday. "We're going to be all right, sweet girl," Grace whispered against Clara's soft hair. "Somehow, we're going to be all right." A knock at the door made her jump. Luke stood on the threshold, dripping wet, his hat in his hands. "Roof's patched," he said. "Won't hold forever, but it'll keep the rain out for now. I noticed the chicken coop's still standing. Figured we might try to get a few hens from town if you're interested. And the garden plot, once this rain soaks in good, we could try replanting. It's late in the season, but with proper water you might get some late summer vegetables." Grace stared at him, overwhelmed by his casual planning for a future she'd stopped believing in. "You're talking like you're staying." Luke shifted his weight, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Just for a few days, like I said. But a few days is enough time to set things right, get you started on the road back to—" "Why?" The question burst out of Grace before she could stop it. "Why are you really doing this? People don't just— Nobody does this. Not without wanting something." For a long moment, Luke was silent, and Grace worried she'd offended him, driven away the only help she had. But then he stepped inside, just over the threshold, careful not to drip on her floor. And when he spoke, his voice carried that weight of old pain she'd heard the day before. "You want the truth, son?" he asked. "Please." Luke looked down at his hands, turning his hat over and over. "When my sister died, I didn't just lose her. I lost myself. Everything I thought I was, a good brother, a protector, someone who could keep the people he loved safe, all of it died with her. I buried her in a plot outside Denver, and then I just started walking, got on a horse, and never stopped moving." He looked up at Grace then, and she saw something raw in his eyes. "For 15 years, I've been trying to outrun it. The guilt, the failure, the image of her face when she was crying from hunger, and I had nothing to give her. I've worked 100 ranches, helped 100 people with small things, but it never felt like enough. It never made up for the one person I couldn't save." Grace felt her throat tighten. "Luke, yesterday, when I saw you on that porch holding your baby, I saw my sister. I saw myself 15 years ago, desperate and failing and watching someone I loved slip away. And I thought, here it is. Here's a chance to do what I couldn't do then, to be what I wasn't then." He paused, his jaw working. "Maybe it won't change anything. Maybe I'll still be the man who let his sister die. But at least I'll be the man who saved someone else's daughter. That's got to count for something." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Grace walked closer to him, Clara in her arms, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle. "Your sister's death wasn't your fault. You were 16 years old, alone, in a drought. You did everything you could. Wasn't enough. It never feels like enough when someone we love dies, Grace said softly. Thomas went out to talk to those rustlers because he thought he could negotiate, thought his words and his decency would appeal to whatever humanity they had left. I begged him not to go. I had a bad feeling, but he kissed my forehead and said, "Grace, we can't live in fear." And he walked out that door. She swallowed hard. For days after, I tortured myself. If I'd begged harder, if I'd hidden his boots, if I'd created some crisis that kept him inside, he'd still be alive. The guilt almost killed me. Luke looked at her, really looked at her, and Grace saw recognition in his eyes. "But you're still here." "Because of her," Grace said, glancing down at Clara. "Because someone had to be. Because giving up would have meant Thomas died for nothing, and I couldn't let that be the end of the story." "That's brave," Luke said quietly. Grace laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "It's not brave. It's just the only choice that didn't end with 2 more graves next to his." They stood there, 2 wounded people finding unexpected common ground, until Clara made a small noise and broke the spell. Luke stepped back, putting his hat on. "I should see to the animals," he said. "But Grace, thank you for sharing that. Sometimes it helps, knowing someone else understands." "Same," Grace replied. "And Luke? You're not the man who let his sister die. You're the man who spent 15 years trying to make sure no one else's sister dies the same way. That counts for a lot more than you think." Something shifted in Luke's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes that suggested her words had reached something deep inside him. He nodded once, then turned and walked back out into the rain. Grace watched him go, feeling that seed of trust crack open a little wider. The next few days fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Luke worked from dawn until dusk, repairing years of neglect that Grace had been too overwhelmed to address even before Thomas died. He fixed the barn door that had been hanging crooked, reinforced the corral fence, cleaned out the well, and got it flowing more freely. He taught Grace how to properly milk Bessie, his hands guiding hers until she got the rhythm right. "Steady pressure, but gentle," he instructed, standing behind her in the barn while rain pattered on the roof. "She'll let you know if you're too rough." Grace concentrated on the task, hyper-aware of Luke's proximity, the warmth of his body behind hers, the low rumble of his voice near her ear. It had been so long since she'd been close to anyone besides Clara, and the sudden rush of awareness caught her off guard. "Like this?" she asked, and was rewarded with a stream of milk hitting the bucket. "Perfect," Luke said, and she heard the smile in his voice. "You're a natural." He stepped back, giving her space, and Grace felt a confusing mix of relief and disappointment. She focused on the milking, trying to ignore the warmth in her cheeks. They talked while they worked, small conversations that gradually grew deeper. Luke told her about the places he'd seen. Mountains in Colorado that touched the clouds, deserts in Arizona where the heat could kill you in hours, plains in Kansas that stretched so far you could see the curve of the earth. Grace told him about Missouri, about the life she'd left behind, about dreams she and Thomas had shared for this homestead. "He wanted to build a bigger house someday," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Clara was asleep inside, and the world felt peaceful in a way it hadn't for weeks. He had plans drawn up and everything, 4 bedrooms, a proper parlor, a kitchen twice the size of what we have now. He said by the time Clara was grown, we'd have the finest house in Cedar Creek. "Sounds like he was a dreamer," Luke observed. "He was," Grace agreed. "Sometimes I thought he dreamed too big, but he'd always say, 'Grace, if you don't dream big, you end up with nothing.' I suppose he was right about that." Luke was quiet for a moment. "You'll build that house someday. Maybe not exactly like he planned, but you'll build something good here. I can see it." "How can you see that when I can't even see past next week?" "Because I've watched you these past few days," Luke said simply. "You're stronger than you think. You survive things that would have broken most people. Once you get back on your feet, there'll be no stopping you." Grace wanted to believe him, but doubt was a hard habit to break. "And what about you? Where will you go when you leave?" The question hung in the air between them. Luke stared out at the horizon, where the sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Don't know," he admitted. "Wherever the road takes me, I suppose. There's always work somewhere, Always someone who needs help. Don't you ever want to stop? To settle down somewhere? Luke's expression became unreadable. Wanting and being able are two different things. I've forgotten how to stay in one place. Wouldn't know what to do with myself. Grace thought about that. Seems lonely. Sometimes, Luke agreed. But sometimes lonely is safer than the alternative. Before Grace could ask what he meant by that, Clara's cry came from inside the house. Grace rose to tend to her daughter, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Luke had just revealed something important, a glimpse into the walls he'd built around himself, walls that maybe weren't so different from her own. On the fourth day after Luke's arrival, the rain finally stopped. The world emerged wet and renewed, the air smelling of damp earth and possibility. The garden plot had turned from dust to mud, and Luke declared it ready for replanting. "We'll need seeds from town," he said over breakfast, a meal that had become a comfortable routine, the two of them eating together while Clara played on a blanket nearby. "I can ride in this afternoon, pick up what we need." Grace hesitated. She hadn't been to Cedar Creek since before Thomas died, hadn't faced the questions and pity she knew would be waiting there. But she also knew Luke shouldn't go alone. People would be suspicious of a stranger buying supplies, especially supplies meant for a widow's homestead. "I should come with you," she said finally. "They know me in town. It'll be easier." Luke looked uncertain. "It's 6 miles there and back. You up for that?" Grace lifted her chin. "I'm stronger than I was 4 days ago, thanks to you. And Clara will be fine. She can ride with me. It's time I showed my face anyway. Let people know we're still here." So that afternoon found them on the road to Cedar Creek, Grace riding Thomas's horse, the one animal the rustlers hadn't taken because it had been lame at the time, with Clara secured in a sling against her chest. Luke rode beside her on his own mount, leading Bessie on a rope behind them. The landscape had transformed with the rain. Green shoots were already pushing up through the earth, and the creeks they crossed actually had water flowing in them. It felt like the land itself was waking up from a long nightmare. "It's beautiful," Grace said, looking around with wonder. "I'd forgotten it could be this beautiful." Luke smiled. "Nature has a way of bouncing back. Give it half a chance and it'll surprise you every time." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the steady clip-clop of hooves and the jingle of tack, the only sounds. Grace found herself sneaking glances at Luke, studying his profile against the afternoon sky. He sat a horse like he'd been born to it, easy and natural, moving with the animal rather than against it. "You're staring again," Luke said without looking at her, and Grace could hear the amusement in his voice. She felt her cheeks heat. "I was just thinking." "About?" "About how strange it is that a week ago I'd never met you, and now I can't imagine the last few days without you here." Luke did look at her then, and something passed between them, something Grace wasn't quite ready to name, but could feel all the same, warm and unsettling in her chest. "Life's strange that way sometimes," he said softly. "People come into your life exactly when you need them, and then leave when you need them to stay." Grace hadn't meant to say it, but the words came out anyway, tinged with a fear she hadn't acknowledged until this moment, the fear that Luke would disappear as suddenly as he'd arrived, leaving her alone again. Luke's expression became serious. "Grace, I know," she interrupted quickly. "You're a drifter. You don't stay places. I'm not trying to... I just meant..." She trailed off, not sure what she meant exactly. "I said a few days," Luke said quietly. "And it's been 4. I should probably move on soon. Let you get back to your life." The words hit Grace harder than they should have. She told herself it was just fear of being alone again, just gratitude for his help, just the natural anxiety of losing a source of support. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She'd started to care about Luke Carver. Not just appreciate him or rely on him, but actually care. About his stories, his pain, his rare smiles, the way he was gentle with Clara, the sound of his voice in the morning saying, "Coffee's ready." And that terrified her, because Thomas had only been gone a month, and what kind of woman developed feelings for another man so soon? What did that say about her marriage, about everything she thought she knew about herself? "Right," she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "Of course. You've already stayed longer than you planned." They rode the rest of the way to Cedar Creek in silence, the easy companionship of earlier replaced by an awkwardness that made Grace want to scream. Cedar Creek wasn't much to look at. A single main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith, and a scattering of houses that made up the residential area. But it was civilization, and after weeks of isolation, Grace felt almost overwhelmed by the sight of other people going about their daily lives. The moment they rode into town, heads turned. Grace could feel the stares, hear the whispers starting. "That's the Whitmore widow," someone said. "Heard her husband was killed by rustlers." "Who's that with her?" "Stranger, by the look of him." Grace kept her head high, refusing to show how much the attention bothered her. Luke rode close beside her, his presence both comforting and likely fueling even more speculation. They stopped at the general store, and Grace was grateful when Luke helped her down from the horse with a steady hand and no judgment in his eyes. Clara was awake and looking around curiously, and Grace adjusted the sling to make sure her daughter was comfortable. Inside the store, Martha Henderson, the owner's wife and the town's primary source of gossip, greeted them with wide eyes and poorly concealed curiosity. "Grace Whitmore. We'd heard. Well, we weren't sure." Martha's eyes darted to Luke, then back to Grace. "How are you, dear? And the baby?" "We're well, thank you," Grace said firmly. "The rain helped considerably. We're here to buy seeds for replanting." Martha's gaze lingered on Luke. "And this is—" "Luke Carver," Luke said, tipping his hat politely. "I've been helping Mrs. Whitmore get her homestead back in order after her loss." The way he said it was perfectly respectful, perfectly innocent, but Grace could see the calculations happening behind Martha's eyes. By tomorrow, the whole town would know that Grace Whitmore had a man staying at her place, and the speculation would be running wild. Part of Grace wanted to explain, to justify, to make sure everyone understood it was all perfectly proper. But another part, a newer, harder part that had been forged in the crucible of the past month, simply didn't care what Martha Henderson or anyone else thought. "We'll need vegetable seeds," Grace said coolly. "Beans, squash, tomatoes if you have them. And some chicken feed. We're hoping to get a few hens started." Martha pulled herself together and began gathering supplies, though her eyes kept drifting back to Luke with undisguised interest. Grace had to admit, objectively, that Luke was the kind of man who drew attention. Tall, handsome in a weathered way, with those unusual gray-blue eyes and that quiet intensity. While Martha wrapped their purchases, the door opened and Reverend Morrison entered, his face lighting up when he saw Grace. "Grace, my dear," he hurried over, taking her free hand in both of his. "We've been so worried about you. When you didn't come to town after Thomas's funeral, we feared the worst." Grace felt a pang of guilt. The Reverend had been kind to her, had buried Thomas with dignity despite the rushed, poorly attended service. "I'm sorry, Reverend. I should have let someone know we were all right. It's been difficult." Of course. The Reverend's eyes, like everyone else's, moved to Luke. "And you've had help, I see." Grace introduced them, watching as the two men shook hands. The Reverend was a good man, she knew, but even he couldn't quite hide his curiosity about the stranger who'd appeared in their grieving widow's life. "Mr. Carver has been extraordinarily kind," Grace said, hearing the defensive edge in her own voice. "He's helped repair the homestead and taught me how to care for the milk cow he generously provided. Without his assistance, Claire and I wouldn't have survived." The Reverend's expression softened with genuine concern. "Things were that dire?" Grace nodded, suddenly fighting tears. "Very nearly. But the Lord provided, as you always say." "He did indeed," the Reverend agreed, looking at Luke with new respect. "Then we're all grateful for Mr. Carver's timely arrival. Will you be staying in Cedar Creek long, sir?" "Just passing through," Luke said, and Grace felt something twist in her chest at the words. "But I wanted to make sure Mrs. Whitmore and her daughter were stable before moving on." They completed their purchases and left the store, Grace acutely aware of the eyes following them. On the street, they nearly ran into Sheriff Daniels, a gruff man in his 50s who'd been investigating Thomas's murder with little success. "Mrs. Whitmore," he greeted her, tipping his hat. His eyes narrowed when they landed on Luke. "Everything all right here?" "Everything's fine, Sheriff," Grace assured him. "This is Luke Carver. He's been helping me with the homestead." The sheriff looked Luke up and down with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years judging men's characters. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about the rustlers who killed Thomas Whitmore, would you?" Luke met his gaze steadily. No, sir. I only arrived in the area 4 days ago, and I've been at Mrs. Whitmore's homestead the entire time. But if I hear anything in my travels, I'll be sure to let you know. The sheriff grunted, apparently satisfied. See that you do. Thomas was a good man. Deserves justice. They parted ways, and Grace let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. I'm sorry about that. The sheriff is just doing his job, Luke finished. No offense taken. He'd be a poor lawman if he didn't question strangers. They loaded their purchases onto the horses and prepared to leave, but before they could mount up, a woman's voice called out from across the street. Grace! Grace Whitmore! Grace turned to see Sarah Chen hurrying toward them, her face flushed with either exertion or emotion. Sarah and her husband owned the ranch bordering Grace's property to the north, and Sarah had been one of the few people who'd visited after Thomas's death, bringing food and offering condolences. Sarah, Grace greeted her warmly. How are you? Never mind me. How are you? We've been so worried. Sarah's eyes took in Grace's improved appearance, Clara's healthy glow, and Luke's presence with obvious curiosity, but Grace was relieved to note no judgment. You look better than when I last saw you. I am better, Grace confirmed. Sarah, this is Luke Carver. Luke, Sarah Chen. She and her husband David run the ranch north of mine. Sarah shook Luke's hand with the firm grip of a woman who worked as hard as any man. Pleased to meet you. Are you the reason Grace looks like she's rejoined the living? Luke smiled slightly. I just helped out a bit. Mrs. Whitmore did the hard part. Sarah looked between them, and something calculating but not unkind crossed her face. Well, whatever you did, thank you. We wanted to help more, but our own situation has been touch and go with the drought. Now that the rains come, though, things might turn around. She turned to Grace. Listen, David and I were talking, and we'd like you to come for dinner tomorrow night. Both of you, she added, nodding to Luke. It's time we all started acting like neighbors again instead of hermits hiding in our separate corners. Grace opened her mouth to decline. Social occasions felt beyond her still, but Sarah held up a hand. I won't take no for an answer. 6 o'clock. Bring the baby. We'll make it an early night. Nothing fancy. But Grace, you need friends right now, and we need to remember there are still good people in the world. Her eyes moved to Luke. Present company included. Before Grace could protest further, Sarah had squeezed her hand, nodded to Luke, and hurried off, leaving them standing in the street with an invitation neither had expected. You don't have to come, Grace said quickly as they mounted their horses. She just assumed, I'd like to, Luke interrupted, if you want me there. Grace looked at him, this man who'd become so important to her so quickly, and felt that flutter in her chest again. I do, she admitted. Want you there, I mean. They rode home as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in colors that seemed too vibrant to be real. The landscape was still green from the recent rain, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Grace felt something that might have been happiness. But as they approached the homestead, that happiness evaporated. A horse was tied to the hitching post, not one Grace recognized, and sitting on her porch as if he had every right to be there, was a man she'd hoped never to see again. Jack Thornton stood as they rode up, a smile on his face that didn't reach his cold eyes. He was a big man, broad and tall, with dark hair and a beard that couldn't hide the cruelty in the set of his mouth. He owned the largest ranch in the area and had been pressuring Thomas for months to sell their land before he died. Grace, he said, his voice carrying false warmth, I was beginning to worry you'd left the area. Grace felt Luke tense beside her, felt the shift in his posture from relaxed to alert. She kept her voice steady as she responded, Mr. Thornton, I wasn't expecting visitors. Thornton's eyes moved to Luke, assessing him with the look of a man calculating threats. And you've got yourself some protection now, I see. Smart. A woman alone out here can't be too careful. What do you want, Mr. Thornton? Grace asked, refusing to dismount until she knew his intentions. Just being neighborly, Thornton said, though his smile suggested otherwise. Checking to see how you're managing after your tragic loss. Thomas was a good man. Foolish, but good. Grace felt anger flash hot in her chest. Foolish? Coming out alone to confront armed men, Thornton said with a shrug. What else would you call it? Luke swung down from his horse in one smooth motion, putting himself between Thornton and Grace. You should watch how you speak about a dead man in front of his widow, he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. Thornton's eyes narrowed. And you are? Someone who doesn't like men who disrespect women or the dead. The tension crackled between them like lightning before a storm. Grace quickly dismounted, clutching Clara close, and stepped forward. Mr. Thornton, I appreciate your concern, but as you can see, we're managing fine. Now, if you'll excuse us, we've had a long day. Thornton's smile turned sharp. Of course. But Grace, before I go, my offer still stands. I'm willing to buy your land, give you enough money to start fresh somewhere easier. A young widow with a baby shouldn't be trying to work a homestead alone. It's not safe, not practical. I'm not alone, Grace said firmly, and I'm not selling. Think about it, Thornton pressed. Thomas is gone. This land nearly killed you. Take the money, go back east. Give your daughter a proper life. My daughter's life is here, Grace snapped, her patience finally breaking. This is her father's land, her inheritance. I'm not selling it to you or anyone else. Thornton's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Grace. This land is too much for a woman on her own. Eventually you'll see that. Better to sell now while you still have a choice. He untied his horse and swung into the saddle, looking down at them with something that might have been pity or threat. Grace couldn't tell which. I'll check back in a few weeks. Maybe by then you'll have come to your senses. He rode off, leaving a wake of unease behind him. Grace stood trembling, fury and fear warring inside her. Who was that? Luke asked, his voice still carrying that dangerous edge. Jack Thornton. He owns the biggest ranch in the county, and he's been trying to buy our land for over a year. Thomas kept refusing, and now... She trailed off, a terrible thought occurring to her. Luke, you don't think that he had something to do with your husband's death? Luke finished grimly. The thought crossed my mind. Men have killed for land before. Grace felt sick. But he's respected in town. He sits on the church board. He couldn't... Respected men can be the worst kind of evil, Luke said. They know how to hide it better. He looked at her seriously. Grace, has he threatened you before? Not directly. But he was persistent with Thomas, kept raising his offer, kept talking about how dangerous it was out here, how we should leave while we could. She hugged Clara tighter. After Thomas died, I thought he'd leave me alone. But if he's still pushing, then he's not going to give up easily. Luke's jaw was tight. Maybe I should stay a while longer, just until we're sure he's not going to cause trouble. Grace's heart leaped at the words, even as her mind screamed caution. You don't have to do that. You've already done so much. I want to, Luke said, and the intensity in his eyes made Grace's breath catch. If Thornton had anything to do with your husband's death, if he's planning something, I won't leave you and Clara vulnerable. They stood there in the gathering dusk, the weight of unspoken things hanging between them. Finally, Grace nodded. Okay, she whispered. Stay, please. That night, after Clara was asleep and the animals were fed, Grace and Luke sat on the porch again, but the easy peace of previous evenings was gone, replaced by a tension that had nothing to do with Jack Thornton. Tell me about your sister, Grace said finally, needing to break the silence. What was her name? Luke was quiet for so long, Grace thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Emma. Her name was Emma. She had blonde hair like sunshine, and she laughed at everything. Used to follow me around the homestead like a baby duck, asking a million questions about everything she saw. His voice carried such tenderness and pain that Grace felt tears prick her eyes. She sounds wonderful. She was. Luke stared out at the darkness. After our parents died, I tried to be everything for her. Mother, father, brother, friend. But I was just a kid myself trying to run a homestead I barely understood. When the drought hit, I made bad decisions. Planted the wrong crops, didn't save enough supplies. By the time I realized how bad things were, it was too late. How old was she when she died? 6. The word came out broken. She died 3 days before her 7th birthday. I'd promised her a cake, even though we had no ingredients. She just smiled and said it was okay, that she wasn't hungry anyway. His hands clenched into fists. She was starving, and she was comforting me. Grace reached out without thinking, covering his fist with her hand. Luke looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, and something passed between them. Understanding, shared grief, and something more, something that made Grace's heart race. "You were a child trying to survive an impossible situation," she said softly. "Emma knew you loved her. That's what mattered." "Did it?" Luke's voice was raw. "She still died. And you're still trying to save every other Emma you meet." Grace squeezed his hand. "That has to mean something." Luke turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers, and Grace felt the touch all the way to her core. They sat like that, hands joined, until the moon rose full and bright over the Texas plains. Finally, Luke spoke again. "I should go to the barn." But he didn't move, and neither did Grace. "Luke," she whispered, "I'm glad you stayed. Not just because of Thornton, because it feels right you being here." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Grace, your husband has only been gone a month." "I know," she interrupted. "Believe me, I know. I think about it every day. Wonder what kind of woman I am for feeling—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "For feeling what?" Luke's voice was barely audible. Grace took a breath, gathered her courage. "For feeling less alone when you're here? For looking forward to hearing your voice in the morning? For wanting you to stay not just for a few more days, but for—" She couldn't say it, couldn't admit even to herself what she really wanted. Luke stood abruptly, pulling his hand away, and Grace felt the loss like a physical ache. He paced to the edge of the porch, his back to her. "Grace, I'm a drifter. I don't stay places. I don't put down roots. Every time I've tried, every time I've let myself care about people, about places, something goes wrong. People die or leave, or I fail them somehow. It's easier to just keep moving." "Easier doesn't mean better," Grace said, standing as well. "You can't spend your whole life running from the past." "Why not?" Luke turned to face her, and in the moonlight, his eyes looked haunted. "It's kept me alive this long." "But have you been living?" Grace challenged. "Or just existing?" The question hung between them, sharp and true. Luke opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a sound split the night, the sound of breaking wood, followed by frightened animal noises from the barn. They both moved at once, Luke grabbing the rifle Grace kept by the door while she rushed inside to check on Clara. The baby was still sleeping, undisturbed, and Grace quickly lit a lamp before running back outside. Luke was already at the barn, the door hanging open. Grace hurried after him, her heart pounding, the lamp casting wild shadows. Inside, chaos. The horses were stamping and whinnying, Bessie was lowing in distress, and the back wall of the barn had a gaping hole in it, as if something had smashed through. "What happened?" Grace gasped. Luke was examining the damage, his face grim. "Someone tried to spook the animals, probably hoping they'd run off. See these marks? Someone took an axe to the wall, then made noise to scare them." Grace felt cold fear wash over her. "Thornton." "Can't prove it," Luke said, "but the timing is suspicious." He turned to her and his expression was fierce. "Grace, this is serious. If he's willing to sabotage your property, he might escalate. You and Clara aren't safe here alone." "I know," Grace whispered, looking at the destruction around them. "I know." Luke set down the rifle and walked to her, taking her by the shoulders. "Then let me stay. Let me help you. Not just for a few days. Let me stay until we know you're safe, until we know Thornton has backed off or been dealt with." Grace looked up at him, this man who'd ridden into her life like salvation, and felt something click into place in her chest. "What if I want you to stay longer than that?" The words hung in the air between them, full of promise and danger and possibility. Luke's hands tightened on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face. "Grace, I'm not asking for promises," she said quickly. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are. But Luke, you make me feel alive again. You make me remember there's more to life than just surviving, and maybe that makes me a terrible person. Maybe it's too soon. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't want you to leave." For a long moment, Luke just stared at her, conflict clear in his face. Then slowly, he raised one hand to her cheek, his touch gentle despite his calloused palm. "You're not wrong," he said softly, and you're not a terrible person. You're Grace Whitmore, the strongest, bravest woman I've ever met. And if I stay, if I let myself care about you and Clara the way I'm already starting to, I don't know if I'll be able to leave when the time comes." "Then don't," Grace whispered. "Don't leave. Stay and help me build something here. Stay and let yourself have a home again." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and fear, and the beginnings of something neither of them had expected to find. Then Luke leaned down, and Grace rose up on her toes, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted like rain and hope and second chances. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I'll stay," he murmured. "For now. For as long as you need me." Grace smiled against his shoulder. "Good, because I think I'm going to need you for a very long time." They stood there in the barn, surrounded by the gentle sounds of animals settling back to sleep, and let themselves believe just for a moment that maybe happy endings were possible after all, even for broken people on the edge of nowhere. The morning after the barn incident dawned bright and clear, but the sunshine couldn't quite dispel the shadow that had fallen over the homestead. Grace woke to find Luke already up, hammering boards over the hole in the barn wall while Bessie grazed peacefully nearby, seemingly unbothered by the previous night's disturbance. She stood at the kitchen window with Clara on her hip, watching him work, and touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the ghost of that kiss. In the clear light of day, she should have felt guilty, should have been drowning in shame for kissing another man so soon after Thomas's death. But all she felt was a warmth that spread through her chest every time Luke looked up and caught her watching. "Your mama's in trouble, sweet girl," Grace murmured to Clara, who babbled happily in response. "She's falling for a cowboy who doesn't know how to stay in one place." But even as she said it, Grace couldn't bring herself to regret it. Luke made her feel things she'd thought died with Thomas. Hope, desire, the bone-deep certainty that maybe, just maybe, life could be good again. She was still watching when Luke finished his repairs and walked toward the house, his shirt already damp with sweat despite the early hour. He paused at the water pump, working the handle until cold water gushed out, then ducked his head under the stream. When he straightened, pushing wet hair back from his face, Grace felt her breath catch. Lord help her, but the man was beautiful in a rough, weathered way that made her pulse quicken. Luke caught her watching through the window and smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made him look years younger. Grace felt her cheeks heat but couldn't look away. He came inside, still drying his face with his bandana. "Morning, coffee's on the stove." "You've already done more work this morning than I do in a full day," Grace said, pouring them both cups. Their fingers brushed as she handed him his, and the touch sent electricity up her arm. "Couldn't sleep much," Luke admitted. "Kept thinking about last night. The barn, I mean," he added quickly, though the color rising in his own cheeks suggested the barn wasn't the only thing he'd been thinking about. Grace busied herself with preparing breakfast, trying to ignore the charged atmosphere between them. "What do we do about Thornton?" "Short term? We're careful. We don't leave the homestead unguarded. I'll sleep in the house from now on," Luke said, then paused. "In the main room, on the floor, proper-like." "Luke, you don't have to Yes, I do." His voice was firm. "If Thornton or his men come back, I need to be close enough to respond fast. And Grace, people in town are already talking. We both know it. I won't give them more ammunition by doing anything that could damage your reputation." Grace wanted to argue that she didn't care what people thought, but that wasn't entirely true, not for her own sake, but for Clara's. Her daughter would grow up in this community, and the things people said about Grace would follow Clara for years. "All right," she agreed, "but you're not sleeping on the floor. We have Thomas's old bedroll. It's in the chest in the bedroom." They fell into the rhythm of breakfast, but the ease of previous mornings had been replaced by an awareness that made every accidental touch feel significant. Grace burned the eggs twice before finally getting them right, too distracted by Luke's presence to focus properly. "You nervous about tonight?" Luke asked as they ate. "The dinner at the Chen's?" Grace had almost forgotten about Sarah's invitation. "A little. I haven't been social since it happened. I don't know how to make small talk anymore. Don't know how to pretend everything's normal when it's not." "Then don't pretend," Luke said simply. "The Chens seem like good people, real people. They'll understand." "What about you? Are you nervous?" Luke considered the question, more curious than nervous. I haven't sat down to a proper dinner with other people in, I can't remember how long. Might have forgotten my table manners. Grace smiled despite herself. Somehow, I doubt that. They spent the rest of the morning working on the garden, turning the rain-softened soil and planting the seeds they'd bought in town. Luke showed Grace how to create proper furrows, how deep to plant each type of seed, how to space them for optimal growth. My father taught me this, he said as they worked side by side. Before he died, before everything went wrong, he used to say that a good garden was the difference between thriving and just surviving. He was right, Grace said, patting soil over bean seeds. Thomas and I had a beautiful garden our first 2 years here. Then the drought came and… She shrugged. We survived? Barely. You'll have a beautiful garden again, Luke assured her. With the rain that came and proper care, you'll have vegetables by late summer, maybe even enough to sell some in town. Grace liked the way he said you'll, as if he'd be there to see it. She didn't let herself think too hard about what would happen when Luke eventually left. For now, he was here, and that was enough. They worked in comfortable silence, the sun warm on their backs, Clara sleeping peacefully in a basket under the shade of the porch. Grace found herself stealing glances at Luke, watching the way he moved, the concentration on his face as he worked, the gentleness in his hands despite their roughness. You're staring again, Luke said without looking up, but she heard the smile in his voice. Can't help it, Grace replied, emboldened by the intimacy of the moment. You're worth staring at. Luke did look up then, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. Grace Whitmore, are you flirting with me? Maybe, she admitted, feeling bold and reckless in a way she hadn't felt since she was a young woman courting Thomas. Is it working? Luke set down his trowel and stood, moving around the garden bed until he was standing in front of her. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair that had escaped her braid behind her ear. Dangerously well, he murmured. They stood there, barely a breath apart, and Grace thought he might kiss her again. She wanted him to, wanted it with an intensity that should have shocked her, but somehow didn't. But then Clara let out a small cry from the porch, and the moment broke. Luke stepped back, clearing his throat. I should, check on the animals. Right, Grace agreed, her voice breathier than she'd intended. And I should feed Clara. They moved apart, both acutely aware of what had almost happened, what was building between them like a storm gathering on the horizon. That afternoon, Grace prepared for the dinner at the Chens with more care than she'd taken with her appearance in months. She had only 2 decent dresses left. Most of her clothes had been worn threadbare from hard work and harder times. She chose the blue calico, the one Thomas had always said brought out her eyes, then immediately felt guilty for thinking about wearing it for Luke to see. You're allowed to move on, she told her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. Thomas wouldn't want you to mourn forever. But was a month long enough? Was a year? How long was a widow supposed to wait before her heart was allowed to feel something for someone else? Grace didn't have answers, so she pushed the questions aside and focused on making herself presentable. She washed her hair in rainwater collected from the recent storm, braided it into a crown around her head, and even pinched her cheeks to bring some color to them. When she emerged from the bedroom with Clara freshly changed and dressed in her best gown, Luke was waiting on the porch in clothes Grace hadn't seen before. Clean dark pants, a white shirt that looked freshly laundered, and a vest that brought out the gray-blue of his eyes. He'd shaved and combed his hair, and Grace's breath caught at the sight of him. You look beautiful, Luke said, his voice rough with sincerity. You clean up pretty well yourself, Grace managed, feeling suddenly shy. They rode to the Chen's ranch as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Clara rode in the sling against Grace's chest, awake and alert, taking in the world with wide eyes. Luke rode beside them, close enough that their legs occasionally brushed, each touch sending sparks through Grace's body. The Chen Ranch was larger than Grace's homestead, with a proper house made of timber rather than sod, a big barn, and several outbuildings. Horses grazed in a green pasture, evidence that the Chens had been better prepared for the drought than most of their neighbors. Sarah Chen met them at the door, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her husband David stood behind her, a tall, quiet man with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "Grace, Mr. Carver, come in, come in!" Sarah ushered them inside, immediately reaching for Clara. "Oh, let me hold this sweet baby. Grace, she's gotten so much bigger since I last saw her." The interior of the Chen home was warm and welcoming, with handmade quilts on the furniture and the smell of home cooking filling the air. Grace felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Thank you for having us," Luke said, shaking David's hand. "It's kind of you to include a stranger." "Any friend of Grace's is welcome here," David replied in his quiet way. "Besides, we hear you've been helping her get back on her feet. That makes you all right in our book." They settled around the dinner table, a solid piece of oak that David had built himself, according to Sarah, and Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the simple normalcy of it all. Breaking bread with friends, sharing a meal, engaging in easy conversation, she'd forgotten how much she needed this. Sarah had prepared a feast by frontier standards: roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from their garden that had somehow survived the drought, and even a berry pie for dessert. As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally. "So, Mr. Carver," Sarah said, passing him more chicken, "Grace mentioned you're a drifter. What brings you through Cedar Creek?" "Just luck, I suppose," Luke replied. "Or providence, depending on how you look at it. I'd been working a cattle drive up from Mexico, got paid off in San Antonio, and decided to head north. Saw Grace's homestead from the ridge and—" He paused, glancing at Grace. "Felt like I should stop." "Well, we're grateful you did," David said. "Grace and the baby would have been in serious trouble without help." "It was that close?" Sarah asked, looking at Grace with concern. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You should have come to us. We would have helped." "I know," Grace whispered. I couldn't seem to do anything but survive day to day. Even thinking about the 6-mile ride to your place felt impossible." "The drought nearly broke us all," David said grimly. "We lost half our herd. Had to shoot 3 horses that went lame from lack of water. There were days I thought about giving up, selling everything, and heading back to California." "What stopped you?" Luke asked. David looked at Sarah, and something passed between them, a look of such deep understanding and love that Grace felt her throat tighten. "We decided we'd rather fail together here than succeed separately somewhere else. This land is ours. We've put too much of ourselves into it to walk away." "That's exactly how Thomas felt," Grace said. "He used to say this homestead was more than just land. It was proof that we could build something lasting, something to pass down to Clara and her children." "And you will," Sarah said firmly. "Now that the rains come, now that you have help, you'll rebuild. The garden will grow, you'll get more animals, and in a few years, this will all feel like a bad dream." Grace wanted to believe her, but doubt still lingered. "Sarah, there's something you should know. Jack Thornton came by yesterday. He's still pushing me to sell." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. David and Sarah exchanged worried glances. "He came to your place?" David asked. "What did he say?" "The usual," Grace replied. "That I can't manage alone, that I should take his offer and leave. But there was something in the way he said it, almost like a threat." "He's been circling that property since before Thomas died," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. "He's wanted to expand his ranch eastward for years, and Grace's land is right in the middle of where he wants to go." "Has he tried to buy your property?" Luke asked David. "Twice," David confirmed. "We refused both times. He wasn't happy about it, but he backed off. We have a bigger operation than Grace, more resources, more hired hands. We're harder to intimidate." "Someone sabotaged Grace's barn last night," Luke said quietly. "Tried to spook the animals, made a hole in the back wall with an axe." Sarah gasped. "You think it was Thornton?" "Can't prove it," Luke admitted, "but the timing is suspicious." David's expression darkened. "That's escalation. If he's willing to do property damage, what's next?" "That's what worries me," Luke said, "which is why I'm staying on for a while, until we're sure Grace and Clara are safe." Sarah looked between Luke and Grace with knowing eyes, and Grace felt her cheeks heat. But Sarah's expression wasn't judgmental. If anything, she looked pleased. "Good," Sarah said firmly. "Grace needs someone on her side, someone who isn't afraid of Thornton." "You think he had something to do with Thomas's death?" Grace asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her mind. "Sarah, David, tell me honestly, do you think Thornton killed him?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, David spoke. "I think Thornton wanted Thomas dead. Whether he pulled the trigger himself or hired someone to do it, I don't know. But Grace, the timing was too convenient. Thomas refuses to sell, and 3 weeks later he's killed by rustlers who happen to steal everything of value but leave no other trace. No one saw them come or go. No one's heard anything about them selling stolen cattle in nearby towns, and the sheriff's investigation went nowhere fast." "David thinks Thornton has Sheriff Daniels in his pocket," Sarah added quietly. "I'm not sure I agree, but I can't deny it looks suspicious." Grace felt cold spreading through her chest. "If that's true, if Thornton really killed Thomas, then Clara and I are in more danger than I thought. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." "Then we make sure he doesn't get it," Luke said, his voice carrying a steel that made everyone look at him. "We protect the homestead, we protect Grace and Clara, and we find proof of what Thornton's done. If we can prove he was behind Thomas's murder, even a compromised sheriff will have to act." "That's easier said than done," David cautioned. "Thornton's careful. He doesn't leave evidence, and he has money, enough to buy silence, enough to buy loyalty." "Everyone has a weakness," Luke said. "We just have to find his." They talked late into the evening, making plans, discussing strategies. By the time Grace and Luke prepared to leave, they had a loose alliance. The Chens would keep their ears open for any information about Thornton, would provide backup if needed, and would check on Grace's homestead regularly. "Thank you," Grace said, hugging Sarah tightly at the door. "For everything. For the meal, for the friendship, for believing me about Thornton." "You're not alone anymore," Sarah whispered back. "Remember that. You have us, and you have him." She nodded toward Luke, who was talking with David near the horses. "And Grace? Don't feel guilty about being happy again. Thomas loved you too much to want you to spend the rest of your life grieving." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Is it that obvious?" "To someone who's been watching? Yes," Sarah smiled. "And for what it's worth, I think he's good for you. You look more alive than you have in months." The ride home was quiet, both Grace and Luke lost in their own thoughts. Clara slept against Grace's chest, her small body warm and trusting. The night was beautiful, the sky full of stars, but Grace couldn't shake the cold fear that had settled in her bones. If Thornton had killed Thomas, what would stop him from killing her? From hurting Clara? From destroying everything they'd built? "Stop," Luke said softly, as if reading her thoughts. "I can hear you spiraling from here." "I'm scared," Grace admitted. "What if we can't stop him? What if he wins?" Luke reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But Grace, I meant what I said. I'm not going anywhere. Not while you and Clara are in danger." "What if he comes after you?" "Let him try," Luke said, and there was something dangerous in his voice. "I'm not Thomas. I won't go out alone trying to negotiate. If Thornton wants a fight, he'll get one." They reached the homestead and Luke helped Grace down from her horse, his hands lingering on her waist longer than strictly necessary. In the moonlight, his eyes looked almost silver. "Thank you," Grace said, "for staying, for helping, for making me feel like maybe things can be okay again." "Grace," Luke murmured, raising one hand to cup her cheek, "you're making it very hard for me to keep my distance." "Then don't," Grace whispered, rising up on her toes to close the distance between them. Their second kiss was different from the first, less desperate, more deliberate. Luke's arms came around her, careful of Clara sleeping between them, and Grace melted into him, letting herself feel everything she'd been holding back. Want, need, hope, desire. It all rushed through her like a river breaking through a dam. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "This is complicated," he said. "I know. People will talk. I know. Your husband's only been dead a month." "I know," Grace repeated, then pulled back to look him in the eye. "But Luke, I can't pretend I don't feel this. I can't pretend you're just someone helping out of the goodness of your heart. You mean more to me than that. Already. And maybe that makes me a terrible person. It doesn't, Luke interrupted fiercely. It makes you human. It makes you someone who's been through hell and is brave enough to reach for happiness when it's offered. Is that what you're offering? Grace asked, hardly daring to hope. Happiness? Luke looked torn, conflict clear on his face. I don't know if I know how to offer that. I've spent 15 years running from everything, everyone. I don't know how to be the kind of man you deserve. Stable, settled, someone you can count on. You've been all of those things for the past week, Grace pointed out. You've been more reliable, more present, more real than anyone in my life right now. For a week, Luke stressed. But what about a month from now? A year? What if I wake up one morning with that old restlessness, that need to move, and I leave? What if I hurt you worse than you're already hurting? Grace considered his words carefully. What if you don't? What if you find out that staying is better than running? That having a home, having people who care about you, having a purpose, what if that's what you've been looking for all these years? Luke looked at her like she'd just offered him something precious and terrifying. You're asking me to take a leap of faith. No, Grace corrected. I'm asking you to take it one day at a time. Stay tomorrow, then the day after that, and the day after that. Don't think about forever. Just think about right now, this moment, and whether you want to be here or somewhere else. I want to be here, Luke said without hesitation. With you and Clara, that's the truth. Then that's enough, Grace said simply. For now, that's enough. They went inside together, and Luke set up his bedroll in the main room while Grace put Clara down in her cradle. When she emerged from the bedroom, Luke was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, looking lost in thought. Grace sat down next to him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Tell me something true, she said. Something you've never told anyone. Luke was quiet for a long moment. I'm tired, he said finally. I'm so tired of moving, of never having a place to call home, of waking up in different towns and not remembering where I am for the first few minutes. I'm tired of being alone. I'm tired of pretending that's what I want. Grace took his hand, holding it between both of hers. Then stop. Stop pretending. Stop running. Let yourself rest. What if I don't remember how? Then I'll teach you, Grace said. Just like you taught me how to milk Bessie, how to plant a garden, how to hope again. I'll teach you how to stay. Luke looked at her, and Grace saw something crack in his expression, some long-held defense finally giving way. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and Grace went willingly, resting her head on his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. They stayed like that for a long time, two broken people holding each other together, until Grace finally pulled back. I should let you sleep, she said reluctantly. Grace, Luke said, catching her hand as she started to stand. Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving. Thank you for the same, Grace replied. She went to her bedroom but left the door open, a small gesture that said, I trust you. I want you near. You're safe here. And for the first time since Thomas died, Grace fell asleep feeling like maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. The next few days passed in a pattern of growing intimacy and shared purpose. Luke and Grace worked side by side, repairing the homestead, tending the garden, caring for the animals. They talked constantly about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pasts, dreams for the future, fears that kept them awake at night. And they touched. Small touches at first, hands brushing as they passed tools, shoulders bumping as they worked, fingers intertwining as they sat on the porch in the evenings. But gradually the touches became bolder, more deliberate. Luke's hand on the small of Grace's back as he guided her through the garden. Grace's fingers trailing through Luke's hair as she tended a cut on his forehead from a run-in with a low barn beam. Stolen kisses in the barn, in the garden, on the porch when Clara was napping. The town noticed, of course. When Grace rode into Cedar Creek with Luke to buy lumber and supplies, the whispers followed them like shadows. Martha Henderson at the general store looked scandalized. Reverend Morrison looked concerned. Even Sheriff Daniels raised an eyebrow. But Grace found she cared less and less. Let them talk. She was alive, her daughter was thriving, and for the first time in months, she had a reason to wake up that went beyond mere survival. It was Sarah Chen who finally addressed it directly. riding over one afternoon with fresh eggs and bread. She found Grace and Luke working on building a new chicken coop, laughing over Luke's attempt to nail boards in a straight line. "You two look happy," Sarah observed, a smile playing at her lips. Grace felt her cheeks heat but didn't deny it. "We are. Is that terrible?" "It's human," Sarah said, dismounting and tying her horse. "Grace, I'm going to give you some advice whether you want it or not. Life on the frontier is too hard and too short to waste time worrying about what people think. If Luke makes you happy, if he's good to you and Clara, if he helps you survive and thrive, then hold on to him with both hands and don't let the gossips make you feel ashamed." "But Thomas would want you to be happy," Sarah finished firmly. "I knew Thomas, remember? I knew him well, and that man loved you more than anything. He wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone mourning him. He'd want you to live." Grace felt tears spill over. "How do I know this is real? How do I know it's not just desperation or gratitude or—" "Does it matter?" Sarah asked gently. "Real feelings are real feelings, regardless of how they start. Maybe this is just comfort right now. Maybe it'll grow into something more. Maybe it won't last. But Grace, you deserve comfort. You deserve companionship. You deserve to feel something other than grief." Luke had stopped working and was watching them, though he was far enough away that he couldn't hear their conversation. Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and felt her heart squeeze with something that felt dangerously close to love. "I think it's already more than comfort," she admitted quietly. Sarah smiled. "Good. Now, I came here to warn you. Thornton's been asking questions in town. About Luke, about where he came from, about how long he's planning to stay. David thinks he's planning something." The warmth Grace had been feeling evaporated, replaced by cold dread. "What kind of something?" "We don't know. But be careful. Watch your backs." "And Grace?" Sarah gripped her hand tightly. "If something happens, if you need help, you come to us immediately. Don't try to handle it alone." After Sarah left, Grace told Luke about the warning. He took it seriously, immediately checking the perimeter of the property, making sure all the animals were secure, even setting up a simple alarm system with tin cans and string that would rattle if someone approached the barn in the night. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," he promised that evening as they sat on the porch. Clara was on Grace's lap, playing with her mother's fingers, and the setting sun painted the world in shades of amber and gold. "You can't promise that," Grace said, though she appreciated the sentiment. "You're just one man, Luke. If Thornton comes with his ranch hands, then I'll fight them all," Luke said, and there was steel in his voice. "Grace, I've spent 15 years trying to make up for failing my sister. I will not fail you and Clara. I won't." Grace reached over and took his hand. "You're not going to fail us. We're going to be fine. All of us." But even as she said it, she felt the shadow of worry in her chest. Thornton was powerful, connected, and apparently without conscience. What chance did they have against a man like that? That night, Grace woke to the sound of horses outside. Not right at the house, but close. Too close. She sat up, heart pounding, and heard Luke already moving in the main room. "Stay inside," he said quietly, appearing in her doorway with the rifle. "Keep Clara quiet." "Luke? Trust me," he said, and then he was gone, slipping out into the night like a shadow. Grace grabbed Clara from the cradle, holding her close, and moved to the window. In the moonlight, she could see shapes moving near the barn. 3, maybe 4 men on horseback. Her blood ran cold. Then she heard Luke's voice, strong and clear in the night. "That's far enough. State your business or ride on." One of the riders laughed. "We got business with the widow Whitmore. She's decided to sell her land to Mr. Thornton. We're here to help her pack up." "She's decided no such thing," Luke replied, and Grace could hear the danger in his tone. "Now I'll give you to the count of 3 to turn those horses around and ride back to wherever you came from." "Or what?" another rider challenged. "You gonna stop all 4 of us by yourself?" "If I have to." There was a moment of tense silence. Then Grace heard the unmistakable sound of a hammer being cocked. She didn't think. She just moved, grabbing Thomas's old revolver from the drawer where she'd hidden it, checking to make sure it was loaded, and stepping out onto the porch with Clara still in her arms. "You're not facing 4 men alone," she called out to Luke. "It's 4 against 2. and I'm a very good shot." It was a lie. She'd only fired a gun a handful of times, but her voice was steady and the revolver in her hand was real enough. The riders shifted uneasily. Whatever they'd expected, it wasn't an armed widow willing to fight. "Mrs. Whitmore," one of them said. She recognized him as Tom Bridger, one of Thornton's ranch hands. "This doesn't have to get ugly. Mr. Thornton just wants what's fair." "What's fair is for you to leave my property," Grace said coldly. "Now." "You're making a mistake," Bridger warned. "Mr. Thornton doesn't take no for an answer." "Then Mr. Thornton is going to have to learn," Luke said. Grace has made her position clear. She's not selling. And if Thornton or any of his men set foot on this property again, without permission, they'll answer to me. "You're just one drifter," Bridger sneered. "You'll move on eventually. Then she'll be alone again." "Maybe," Luke agreed. "Or maybe I'll stay. Either way, it's none of your concern. Now ride out before someone gets hurt." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then Bridger spat on the ground and wheeled his horse around. "This ain't over," he called back as the four riders disappeared into the darkness. Grace stood frozen on the porch, shaking so hard she thought her legs might give out. Luke was beside her in an instant, gently taking the revolver from her trembling hands. Hey, you're okay," he murmured, guiding her back inside. "You're safe. Clara's safe. I've got you." Grace sank onto the nearest chair, holding Clara tight while the baby fussed at the sudden commotion. "They were going to force me off my land," she whispered. "They were going to—" "But they didn't," Luke said firmly. "And they won't. Grace, you were incredible out there, brave and fierce and absolutely terrifying." Despite everything, Grace felt a weak laugh bubble up. "I was?" "Completely. I think you scared them more than I did." The laughter turned to tears, and Grace found herself sobbing, for Thomas, for the fear, for the unfairness of it all. Luke pulled her close, careful of Clara between them, and just held her while she fell apart. "I can't do this," she gasped between sobs. "I can't fight Thornton. He's too powerful, too determined. Maybe I should just sell, take whatever he offers, leave." "No," Luke said sharply, pulling back to look at her. "Grace, look at me. You are not running. You are not giving up. This land is yours. It's Clara's inheritance, and you're going to fight for it. And you're not fighting alone. You have me. You have the Chens. You have neighbors who will stand with you once they know what Thornton's really doing." "But what if—" "No what ifs," Luke interrupted. "We take this one day at a time, remember? Right now, today, we're safe. Tomorrow we'll be smart, we'll be careful, and we'll figure out our next move. But we don't give up. Understand?" Grace looked at him through her tears and saw such fierce determination in his face that she couldn't help but believe him. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. We don't give up." "That's my girl," Luke said softly, and something in the way he said "my girl" made Grace's breath catch. They stayed up the rest of the night, Luke keeping watch while Grace dozed fitfully with Clara in her arms. As dawn broke over the plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Grace made a decision. She wasn't running, she wasn't selling. This was her home, her land, her future. And she was going to fight for it with everything she had, even if it killed her. The morning after Thornton's men came brought a decision that changed everything. Grace stood at her kitchen window, watching Luke check the perimeter for the third time since sunrise, and realized that fighting wasn't enough anymore. They needed to take action, to find proof of Thornton's crimes before he escalated from intimidation to something worse. "We need to go to the sheriff," she said when Luke came back inside, his face drawn with worry and lack of sleep. Luke shook his head immediately. "The Chens think Daniels might be compromised. If we tip our hand to the wrong person—" "Then we don't go to Daniels," Grace interrupted. "We go around him. There's a federal marshal who rides through the territory every few months. David Chen mentioned him once, said he's an honest man who doesn't take bribes. If we can get word to him about what Thornton's doing, about what we suspect he did to Thomas—" "That could take weeks," Luke pointed out. "Months even. And in the meantime, Thornton's not going to sit idle." "I know." Grace paced the small kitchen, Clara on her hip. "But Luke, what's the alternative? We can't just wait here to be attacked. We need allies. We need the law on our side. We need something more than just the two of us and a rifle." Luke was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he thought. Finally, He nodded slowly. All right, but we do this smart. We gather evidence first, anything we can find that connects Thornton to Thomas's death, to the harassment, to the barn damage. Then we get that evidence to the marshal. But Grace, that means we need to be careful. If Thornton suspects we're building a case against him, he'll come at us harder, Grace finished. I know, but what choice do we have? The answer hung unspoken between them. None. They had no choice at all. Over the next week, they fell into a new rhythm, one born of necessity and growing desperation. Luke rode into town every other day asking careful questions at the saloon, the general store, anywhere men gathered and talked. He was looking for anyone willing to speak against Thornton, any witnesses to Thomas's murder, any scrap of information that might help their case. Grace, meanwhile, began writing everything down in an old ledger she'd found in Thomas's things. Every incident, every threat, every suspicious occurrence. She documented it all with dates and details, building a record that might mean the difference between justice and being forced off her land. And Clara, oblivious to the danger surrounding them, simply grew. She was thriving on Bessie's milk and Grace's renewed health, hitting milestones that made Grace's heart swell with pride and ache with the knowledge that Thomas would never see them. First smiles, first attempts at rolling over, first real laughter. All of it happened while Luke was there, and Grace caught herself thinking of them less as Luke and Grace and more as we, us, a unit that included all three of them. It was dangerous thinking. Luke had never promised to stay, had never said the words that would make this situation anything other than temporary. But Grace couldn't help the way her heart leaned toward him, couldn't stop herself from imagining a future where he didn't leave, where they built something real and lasting together. One afternoon, while Luke was in town and Grace was hanging laundry, Sarah Chen rode up with news written all over her face. "Grace!" She dismounted quickly, looking around to make sure they were alone. "I need to tell you something. David was in town yesterday, and he overheard Tom Bridger, one of Thornton's men, talking to another ranch hand at the saloon. He was drunk, saying things he probably shouldn't have." Grace's heart began to race. What kind of things? "He said Thornton paid him and 3 others to take care of the Whitmore problem back in August. That's when Thomas died, Grace. Bridger didn't come right out and say they killed him, but the implication was clear enough. And there's more. Apparently Thornton's planning to force you off the land before winter. He thinks if you have to face another harsh season alone, you'll break." The laundry basket fell from Grace's hands, clean clothes spilling onto the ground. "Did David hear anything specific? Names, dates, anything we could use?" He tried to stay and listen for more, but Bridger noticed him and shut up fast. "But Grace, this is it. This is the proof you needed. If we can get Bridger to talk when he's sober, or find the other men who were involved." "They'll never talk voluntarily," Grace said, her mind racing. "Not without protection. Thornton would kill them for betraying him." "Then we need that marshal," Sarah said urgently. "We need someone with authority who can offer them immunity or protection in exchange for testimony." Grace bent to pick up the fallen laundry, her hands shaking. "Luke's in town right now asking questions. When he gets back, we need to figure out how to contact the marshal. Sarah, how do we even find him? Do you know his route?" "David might. He's dealt with the territorial marshal's office before over cattle disputes." Sarah helped gather the clothes, then gripped Grace's arm tightly. "Grace, you need to be extra careful now. If Bridger realizes he said too much, if Thornton finds out we're investigating—" "I know," Grace whispered. "Believe me, I know." When Luke returned that evening, Grace and Sarah told him everything. His expression grew darker with each word, and by the time they finished, his hands were clenched into fists. "Bridger," he said quietly, and there was something lethal in his voice. "I've seen him around. Big guy, scar over his left eye." "That's him," Sarah confirmed. "I could make him talk," Luke said, and Grace felt a chill run down her spine at the cold certainty in his tone. "No," she said firmly. "Luke, if you assault one of Thornton's men, you'll be the one in jail. The sheriff would love an excuse to lock you up, get you away from me." "She's right," Sarah agreed. "We do this by the book, or we give Thornton ammunition to use against us." Luke paced the small kitchen like a caged animal, his frustration palpable. "Then how? How do we get justice for Thomas? How do we stop Thornton before he hurts someone else?" "We find the marshal," Grace said. We give him everything we have, everything we know, and we trust that the law will do what it's supposed to do. The law failed, Thomas, Luke shot back. The law has been failing you for months. Why should we believe it'll work now? Because we have to, Grace said simply. Because the alternative is vigilante justice, and that makes us no better than Thornton. Luke, please. I know you want to protect us. I know you want to fix this, but we have to do it the right way. Luke looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. All right, we do it your way. But Grace, if Thornton comes for you again, if he threatens you or Clara, I'm not waiting for the law. Understood? Understood, Grace agreed softly. Sarah stayed for dinner, and the three of them made plans late into the evening. David would discreetly contact the marshal's office and find out when he'd next be riding through the territory. In the meantime, Grace would continue documenting everything, and Luke would keep watching Thornton's movements, looking for patterns, for weaknesses, for any opportunity to gather more evidence. After Sarah left, Grace put Clara to bed and found Luke on the porch, staring out at the darkness with tension written in every line of his body. Talk to me, she said softly, sitting beside him. Luke was quiet for so long Grace thought he might not answer. Then, I've killed men before. The words hung in the air between them, stark and honest. Grace felt her breath catch, but she didn't pull away. During the war? She asked. After. Luke's voice was flat, emotionless. 3 years after, to be exact. I was working a ranch in New Mexico, and some bandits raided the place. Killed the owner, his wife, tried to steal everything including the horses. I was in the barn when it happened. I had a rifle. I used it. Grace waited, sensing there was more. I killed 2 of them, Luke continued. Shot them dead without hesitation, without remorse. The 3rd one ran, and I let him go. The law said it was justified, said I was defending property and innocent lives. But Grace, the thing is, I didn't feel bad about it. Not then, not now. Those men deserved what they got. And you're wondering if that makes you a bad person, Grace said quietly. No. Luke finally looked at her. I'm wondering if it makes me the kind of person who could kill Thornton and his men in cold blood, if it came to that. If I could justify it the same way I justified those killings in New Mexico. Because Grace, when I think about what they did to Thomas, what they're trying to do to you, I want to kill them. I want it badly enough that it scares me. Grace took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. But you haven't. You're sitting here talking to me about the law and doing things the right way, even though every instinct is probably screaming at you to ride into town and put a bullet in Thornton's head. Only because you asked me not to. That's what makes you a good man, Luke. Not the absence of violent thoughts, but the choice not to act on them. The choice to do what's right instead of what's easy. Luke brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. You have too much faith in me. Or maybe you don't have enough faith in yourself, Grace countered. Luke, I know who you are. I've seen you with Clara, gentle and patient. I've seen you work yourself to exhaustion fixing things around the homestead. I've seen you make hard choices, good choices, even when they cost you. That's the man you are. The rest is just noise. I don't deserve you, Luke said roughly. Good thing I'm not asking what you deserve then. I'm just asking you to stay. They sat in silence for a while, hands joined, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Finally, Luke spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm falling in love with you. I know it's too soon, I know it's complicated, I know I shouldn't, but I am. I'm falling in love with you and Clara, with this place, with the life we could have here. And it terrifies me because I've spent 15 years making sure I never cared about anything enough to lose it. Grace's heart felt too big for her chest, swelling with emotion so intense it almost hurt. Luke, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted quickly. I know it's been less than 2 weeks. I know your husband just died. I know I'm asking too much. I love you too, Grace said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. I know I shouldn't. I know it makes me terrible. I know people will judge me. But I do. I love you, Luke Carver. I love the way you look at Clara like she's precious. I love the way you fix things without being asked. I love the sound of your voice in the morning and the way you make me laugh, even when everything feels impossible. I love that you're honest about your darkness, instead of pretending it doesn't exist. I love you. Luke stared at her like she'd just given him the world. Then he pulled her close, careful not to crush her, and kissed her with a tenderness that made tears spring to Grace's eyes. Say it again, he murmured against her lips. I love you. Again. I love you, Luke Carver. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Grace felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. When they finally pulled apart, Luke rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to marry you, he said. I don't know when, I don't know how, but Grace Whitmore, I'm going to make you my wife. I'm going to adopt Clara and give her my name. I'm going to build that big house Thomas planned, and I'm going to fill it with children and laughter and everything good this life has to offer. I promise you that. Grace laughed through her tears. You're making a lot of promises for a man who claims he doesn't know how to stay. I'm learning, Luke said. You're teaching me. They moved inside together, and for the first time since Luke had arrived, Grace didn't retreat to her bedroom alone. Instead, they lay down on his bedroll together, fully clothed and proper, with Clara sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby. Luke wrapped his arms around Grace, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Tell me about the future, she whispered. Tell me what happens after we beat Thornton. Luke's hand stroked through her hair, gentle and soothing. After we beat Thornton, we expand the homestead. We get more cattle, more horses. We hire help so you don't have to work yourself to the bone. We build a real barn, repair the house properly, maybe add on those extra rooms. Clara grows up healthy and strong, learning to ride before she can barely walk. We have more children, 2, 3, however many you want. That sounds nice, Grace murmured, already half asleep. We grow old together, Luke continued softly. We watch our grandchildren play in the yard. And on quiet evenings, we sit on the porch and remember this time, when everything was hard and scary and uncertain, and we're grateful we survived it together. Grace smiled against his chest. I like that future. Me too, Luke said. Me too. They fell asleep like that, tangled together, and Grace felt safer than she had in months. But safety, as they would soon learn, was an illusion easily shattered. Grace woke to Clara's crying and pale dawn light filtering through the windows. Luke was already up, standing at the window with tension in his shoulders that made Grace's stomach clench. What is it? She asked, hurrying to pick up Clara. Ryder coming, Luke said tersely. Fast! Grace's heart began to race. They both moved to the door, Luke with rifle in hand, Grace clutching Clara protectively. But as the rider came closer, Grace recognized the horse. It's David Chen, she said with relief. David pulled up hard, his horse lathered and breathing hard. His face was grim. They arrested Sarah, he said without preamble. Sheriff Daniels came to our place last night with 2 deputies, said she'd been spreading false accusations about Jack Thornton, damaging his reputation. They took her to town, locked her up. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. She hasn't accused Thornton of anything publicly. We've been careful. Someone told him, David said, his voice shaking with fury. Someone told Thornton what Sarah heard Bridger say, and now he's using the sheriff to silence her. They're saying if she doesn't recant her lies, they'll charge her with slander and defamation. Could mean jail time, fines we can't afford. It's a message, Luke said quietly. To us. He's saying back off or face consequences. I'm not backing off, David said fiercely. Sarah's done nothing wrong, but I need help. I need witnesses who will speak up, who'll tell the truth about what Thornton's been doing. Grace, Luke, I need you. Grace looked at Luke, saw the calculation in his eyes. If they spoke up publicly, they'd be painting a target on their backs bigger than they already had. Thornton would know they were actively working against him. But if they stayed silent, Sarah would suffer for trying to help them. We'll testify, Grace said before Luke could object. Whatever Sarah needs, we'll do it. Grace, Luke started. No, she interrupted firmly. Sarah was willing to help us. Now we help her. That's what neighbors do. That's what friends do. Luke looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but we do this smart. David, who else in town would speak against Thornton if they had protection? The widow Patterson lost her husband to rustlers 2 years ago, David said. Her land bordered Thornton's and he bought it from her for half what it was worth. And there's old Jim Walker. He used to work for Thornton until he saw something he shouldn't have. Thornton fired him, blackballed him from working at any other ranch in the territory. He's barely scraping by now, but he might talk if we could guarantee his safety. We need that marshal, Luke said urgently. David, any luck tracking him down? I sent word to the territorial office 3 days ago. Haven't heard back yet. David's face was drawn with worry. I don't know how long Sarah has. The hearing's set for tomorrow afternoon. If we don't get her released by then we get her released, Grace said with more confidence than she felt. Luke, we ride to town now. We talk to everyone David mentioned. We get statements, witnesses, anything that proves Thornton's been systematically driving people off their land. And if the sheriff won't listen, we go over his head. We make enough noise that someone with authority has to pay attention. It was bold, possibly foolish, and definitely dangerous. But it was also the only option they had. They made plans quickly. David would return to town, watch over Sarah as best he could. Luke and Grace would gather Clara and ride in within the hour, and they'd start building their case publicly, consequences be damned. Grace, if we do this, there's no going back, Luke warned as they prepared to leave. Thornton will know we're not backing down. He'll escalate. Then we'll be ready, Grace said, checking the revolver she now carried whenever they left the homestead. Luke, I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of hiding. Thomas died because he tried to negotiate with evil men. I won't make the same mistake. We fight or we lose everything. Luke looked at her with something like awe. You're the bravest person I've ever met. No, Grace corrected, settling Clara into her sling. I'm just a mother protecting her child and a woman defending her home. That's not bravery. That's survival. They rode to Cedar Creek with the morning sun at their backs, and Grace felt strangely calm despite the danger ahead. Whatever happened next, at least they were taking action. At least they were fighting back. The town was buzzing with news of Sarah's arrest by the time they arrived. People clustered in small groups, talking in low voices that stopped when Grace and Luke rode past. Grace held her head high, refusing to show fear or shame. They went first to the sheriff's office, where Sheriff Daniels sat behind his desk looking distinctly uncomfortable. Mrs. Whitmore, he greeted her, his eyes flicking to Luke with undisguised hostility. If you're here about Mrs. Chen, I can't help you. She broke the law. By telling the truth, Grace interrupted. Sheriff, Sarah Chen did nothing wrong. She overheard a confession to murder and she reported it. If anyone should be in that cell, it's Tom Bridger and Jack Thornton. Daniel's face reddened. Now you listen here. Mr. Thornton is a respected member of this community. You can't just go around accusing him of murder without proof. Then let us gather proof, Luke said calmly. Release Mrs. Chen, drop the charges, and give us time to build a proper case. Bring in the territorial marshal, let him investigate. I don't need a marshal interfering in my jurisdiction, Daniel snapped, and I don't need a drifter telling me how to do my job. Then do your job, Grace said, her voice sharp as a blade. Investigate Thomas's murder properly. Question Bridger about what he said. Look into the other suspicious deaths and land acquisitions around Thornton's property. Be a lawman instead of Thornton's puppet. The sheriff stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. That's enough. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you're grieving, but you need to accept that your husband's death was a tragic accident perpetrated by unknown rustlers. Making wild accusations isn't going to bring him back. Unknown rustlers who were never seen before or since, Luke said quietly. Unknown rustlers who stole everything of value but left no tracks, no witnesses, no trail. Unknown rustlers who just happened to strike after Thomas refused to sell his land to Jack Thornton. You really expect us to believe that's coincidence? Daniel's hand moved to his gun belt, and Grace felt Luke tense beside her. I think you should leave now, the sheriff said coldly. Both of you, before I find a reason to arrest you too. They left, but Grace's hands were shaking with fury. Outside, she turned to Luke. He's not going to help. He's either being paid by Thornton or he's too cowardly to stand up to him. Probably both, Luke agreed grimly. All right. Plan B. We find those witnesses David mentioned, we get their stories, and we create enough public pressure that Daniels has no choice but to act. Over the next several hours, they crisscrossed Cedar Creek, talking to anyone who'd listen. They found Widow Patterson at the boarding house where she'd been living since losing her homestead. She was a tired woman in her 50s, worn down by grief and hardship. "I know Thornton forced me out," she said quietly, glancing around nervously to make sure no one was listening. "After my Henry died, Thornton's men started coming around. Little accidents kept happening. Fence posts breaking, livestock getting out. One of my horses going lame under suspicious circumstances. When I finally agreed to sell, Thornton offered me half what the land was worth. I tried to refuse, and suddenly the bank was calling in loans I didn't know I had. Henry had borrowed money from Thornton years before, you see. I had no choice." "Would you testify to that?" Grace asked gently. "If we could guarantee your safety, would you tell what you know?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "And end up like that Chinese woman in jail? Or worse, like your husband, Mrs. Whitmore? I'm sorry, but I have grandchildren depending on me. I can't risk it." They got similar responses from 3 other potential witnesses, people who knew or suspected Thornton's crimes but were too afraid to speak up. Grace felt despair creeping in with each refusal. But then they found Jim Walker. He was living in a shack on the outskirts of town, doing odd jobs for pennies, a broken man who'd once been a proud ranch foreman. But when Luke and Grace explained what they needed, something sparked in his eyes. "I've been waiting for someone to stand up to that bastard," he said. "I worked for Thornton for 5 years. I saw things, terrible things. Men beaten for questioning his orders. Rustlers he hired to steal from his neighbors so he could buy their land cheap when they couldn't recover from the losses. And I saw him plan your husband's death, Mrs. Whitmore." Grace's world tilted. "You saw—" "I heard him talking to Bridger and 3 others. August 15th, night before your husband died. Thornton told them to handle the Whitmore situation permanently. Said to make it look like rustlers, take the livestock to cover the trail. I knew what he meant. I went to him after, told him I wouldn't be part of murder. He fired me on the spot, told every rancher in 3 territories that I was a drunk and a thief. Ruined my reputation so thoroughly I couldn't get work anywhere." "Mr. Walker," Luke said urgently, "would you testify to this? Would you sign a statement?" Walker looked at them with haunted eyes. "What's the point? Thornton owns the sheriff. He'll never be prosecuted." "Not by Daniels," Grace agreed. "But there's a federal marshal who has jurisdiction. If we can get word to him, if we can build a case—" "I'll testify," Walker interrupted. "God help me, I'll testify. I've got nothing left to lose anyway, and maybe this way Henry Whitmore's death won't be for nothing." "Thomas," Grace corrected softly. "His name was Thomas." "Thomas," Walker repeated. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. He seemed like a good man." They got Walker's statement written down, signed and dated, with Reverend Morrison as a witness. The Reverend was deeply troubled by what he heard, and he promised to add his own voice to the growing chorus demanding investigation. By late afternoon, they'd gathered enough evidence and testimony to at least raise serious questions about Thornton's activities. It wasn't enough for a conviction, but it was enough to demand the marshal's involvement. The hearing for Sarah Chen was held in the town hall, with what seemed like half of Cedar Creek in attendance. Thornton sat in the front row, looking confident and relaxed, while Sarah stood before the makeshift judge's bench looking defiant despite her night in jail. Grace and Luke entered together, and Grace felt every eye in the room turn toward them. Let them stare. Let them judge. She was done caring what people thought. The judge was actually the mayor, Hiram Foster, a portly man who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the proceedings. He cleared his throat nervously. "We're here to address the charges of slander and defamation against Mrs. Sarah Chen brought by Mr. Jack Thornton. Mr. Thornton, would you state your complaint?" Thornton stood, every inch the respectable rancher and upstanding citizen. "Mayor Foster, this woman has been spreading vicious lies about me throughout the community. She's accused me of criminal activity without a shred of evidence, damaging my reputation and my business relationships. I'm simply asking for justice and for her to publicly retract her false statements." "Mrs. Chen," the mayor said wearily, "do you have a response?" Sarah stood tall. "Everything I said was true. I overheard Tom Bridger, one of Mr. Thornton's employees, confess to being involved in Thomas Whitmore's murder on Mr. Thornton's orders. If that's slander, then arrest Mr. Bridger and let him deny it under oath." The room erupted in whispers. Thornton's face darkened, but he kept his voice calm. Bridger was drunk, probably bragging to impress someone. You can't take the ramblings of a drunk man as evidence of anything. Then let's hear from other witnesses, Grace called out, standing. People who've seen Mr. Thornton's tactics, who've suffered under his systematic campaign to drive settlers off their land so he can expand his ranch. Mrs. Whitmore, Mayor Foster said uncomfortably, this isn't your hearing. But it is about my husband's murder, Grace shot back. And if you're going to sit there and pretend Jack Thornton is an innocent victim, then you need to hear what I have to say. She pulled out the statements they'd gathered, along with her own detailed documentation of the harassment she'd suffered. Luke stood beside her, a silent wall of support, as she laid out their case piece by piece. The room grew quieter as she spoke, and Grace saw doubt creeping into people's faces. They knew Thornton was powerful, maybe even suspected he was ruthless, but hearing the evidence laid out so plainly, it was harder to dismiss. These are serious accusations, Mayor Foster said when Grace finished. But Mrs. Whitmore, without concrete proof, then get concrete proof, David Chen called out, standing. Bring in the territorial marshal. Let him investigate properly. If Thornton's innocent, he has nothing to fear from a federal investigation. I won't be subjected to this witch hunt, Thornton said, standing. Mayor Foster, either charge Mrs. Chen or release her, but I won't sit here and be accused of crimes I didn't commit by a grieving widow and her paramour. The word hung in the air like an insult. Grace felt Luke stiffen beside her, felt the anger radiating off him in waves. Careful, Luke said quietly, but with unmistakable menace. You're talking about the woman I love, the woman I'm going to marry. Choose your next words very carefully. The room went completely silent. Grace felt heat flood her cheeks, not from shame, but from the public declaration, from the way Luke had claimed her in front of the entire town without hesitation or apology. Thornton laughed mockingly. Mary, the man's a drifter who's been in town less than 2 weeks, and you're already talking marriage? How convenient that he showed up right after your husband died. Luke saved our lives, Grace said clearly. He gave us food when we were starving, shelter when we had nothing, hope when I'd lost everything. And yes, I love him. I know it seems too soon to some of you. I know people will judge, but I don't care anymore. I'm alive because of Luke Carver, and my daughter is alive because of him, and if that's not worth loving someone for, I don't know what is. Reverend Morrison stood up. Mayor Foster, I've heard Mrs. Whitmore's testimony, and I've witnessed the statements she's collected. I believe there's enough evidence here to warrant further investigation. I formally request that you contact the Territorial Marshal's office and invite them to look into these matters. I second that, called out Martha Henderson, surprisingly. Grace looked at her in shock, and Martha gave her a small, apologetic smile. I may gossip too much, but I know right from wrong, and this doesn't feel right. One by one, other townspeople stood, not many, but enough. Enough to show that Grace and Sarah weren't alone, that people were willing to question Thornton's power, that justice might actually be possible. Mayor Foster looked between Thornton and the growing number of standing citizens, and Grace saw him make a decision. Very well. I'm releasing Mrs. Chen without charges, and I'm requesting an investigation from the Territorial Marshal's office. Mr. Thornton, if you're innocent as you claim, this should clear your name conclusively. Thornton's face went hard as stone. He stood, buttoned his jacket with deliberate calm, and looked directly at Grace. You're making a terrible mistake, Mrs. Whitmore. Both of you. Remember that when the consequences come. He strode out of the town hall, and Grace felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm afternoon. They'd won this battle, but she had no illusions about what it meant. The war with Jack Thornton had just begun in earnest. That evening, after Sarah had been reunited with David and everyone had returned home, Grace and Luke sat on their porch watching the sunset. Clara was asleep inside, and the world felt precariously peaceful. He's going to come after us, Grace said quietly. Soon. Hard. I know, Luke agreed, but we made the right choice. We stood up for what's right. Even if it costs us everything? Luke took her hand, lacing their fingers together. Grace, everything I have worth losing is sitting right here beside me. You and Clara, you're my everything now. I'll fight for you with my last breath. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens, you won't sacrifice yourself for us. Promise me you'll fight to survive, to stay alive, because Clara needs a father, and I need—" Her voice broke. "I need you, Luke. I can't lose you too." Luke pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I promise. We survive this together, all three of us. No heroic sacrifices, no martyrdom, just us, fighting smart and fighting to win." They sat there until the stars came out, holding each other against the darkness, and Grace let herself believe, just for a moment, that love might actually be enough to see them through. But deep down, she knew the hardest test was still to come. The storm came 3 days after the hearing, but it wasn't made of rain and thunder. It came in the form of 6 riders approaching the homestead just after dawn, when the world was still wrapped in that gray light between night and day. Grace was feeding Clara when Luke burst through the door, rifle already in hand, his face set in grim lines she'd come to recognize as his battle face. "Get Clara to the root cellar," he said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Now, Grace, don't argue." Grace's heart seized, but she moved quickly, grabbing the bag she'd packed for exactly this scenario: supplies, diapers, water, the revolver Thomas had given her on their wedding day. She kissed Luke hard and fast. "Don't you dare die on me, Luke Carver." "Not planning on it," he said, already moving to the window. "Get down there and don't come out until I say it's safe." Grace ran to the back of the house where the root cellar door was hidden under a rug. She pulled it open, descended into the darkness with Clara clutched to her chest, and pulled the door closed above them. Through the cracks in the floorboards, she could hear everything. "That's far enough." Luke's voice carried clear and strong through the morning air. "State your business or turn around." "Our business is with Mrs. Whitmore." Grace recognized Tom Bridger's voice, rough and mean. "Mr. Thornton's making her a final offer on the land, very generous considering recent events." "She's not interested," Luke said. "Now ride out before this gets ugly." Bridger laughed, and Grace heard the click of multiple guns being cocked. "See, that's where you're wrong, Drifter. You're outnumbered 6-1. You might get one of us, maybe 2 if you're lucky, but the rest will burn this place to the ground with you in it. Mr. Thornton's done being patient." "Then he should have come himself instead of sending lackeys," Luke called back. "Tell Thornton if he wants this land, he can face me man to man. Otherwise, you boys can ride back and tell him you failed. Again." "Last chance," Bridger warned. "Call out the widow, have her sign the papers, and we'll leave peaceful-like. Otherwise—" The shot that rang out cut him off mid-sentence. Grace flinched in the darkness, clutching Clara tighter, biting her lip to keep from crying out. Another shot answered, then another, and suddenly the air was full of gunfire. Grace pressed her hand over Clara's mouth gently, keeping the baby quiet even as her own heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. She counted shots, tried to track Luke's position by sound, prayed harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. Then she heard it, a cry of pain that made her blood run cold. Luke's voice, sharp with agony. "Luke!" The name tore from her throat before she could stop it. "Stay down!" Luke shouted back, and Grace heard the strain in his voice, heard the pain he was trying to hide. "Don't come out, Grace! Don't!" More gunfire drowned out his words. Grace heard horses screaming, men shouting, the horrible thud of something heavy hitting the ground. Every instinct screamed at her to go up there, to help, to fight beside him, but she had Clara to think of. If she died, her daughter would be an orphan. But if Luke died? The thought was unbearable. The gunfight seemed to last forever and no time at all. Finally, the shots grew sporadic, then stopped altogether. Grace heard hoofbeats, riders leaving fast, their mission either accomplished or abandoned. Then silence. Terrible, complete silence. "Luke?" Grace called out, her voice shaking. "Luke, answer me!" Nothing. Grace made a decision. She tucked Clara into the corner of the root cellar, surrounded by sacks that would cushion her if she rolled, and whispered, "Stay quiet, baby girl. Mama will be right back." She climbed up through the trapdoor, revolver in hand, and her heart stopped at the scene before her. The porch was riddled with bullet holes. One of Thornton's men lay motionless near the barn, whether dead or unconscious, Grace couldn't tell. Another was crawling toward his horse, leaving a trail of blood. And Luke was on the ground near the water trough, his left side dark with blood, the rifle fallen from his hands. But he was moving, trying to push himself up, and Grace ran to him with a sob of relief. "Don't move," she said urgently, dropping to her knees beside him. "Let me see." "Grace, get back inside," Luke gasped. "They might come back." "They're gone," Grace said, already tearing at his shirt to assess the damage. The bullet had gone through his side, missing anything vital by what looked like inches. Blood flowed freely, but it wasn't the arterial spray that meant death. "You're going to be fine. You hear me? You're going to be fine." "Stubborn woman," Luke muttered, but his lips quirked in something that might have been a smile. "Told you to stay down." "And miss seeing you take on 6 men single-handedly? Not a chance." Grace was already pulling off her apron, wadding it up, pressing it to the wound to slow the bleeding. Luke hissed in pain but didn't pull away. "How many did you get?" 3 down, 3 ran. Bridger took a bullet to the shoulder. He was the crawler. Might not make it. Luke's eyes were starting to glaze with pain and shock. "Grace, Clara, is safe in the cellar. Now shut up and let me work." Grace's hands were steady even as her voice shook. She'd helped birth calves, mended horses, dealt with all manner of frontier injuries. She could do this. She had to do this. She got Luke inside, half dragging, half carrying him despite his protests. Once he was on the bed, she retrieved Clara from the cellar, then set about properly tending Luke's wound. She boiled water, cleaned the entry and exit wounds, packed them with clean cloth, and wrapped his torso tightly with strips torn from her best petticoat. Luke drifted in and out of consciousness through it all, occasionally muttering things that made no sense. Emma's name, apologies, declarations of love that made Grace's eyes sting with tears. "You're not dying on me," she told him fiercely as she worked. "We have a wedding to plan, remember? A house to build. Children to raise. You don't get to leave me now, Luke Carver. Not after making me love you." By the time she finished, dawn had given way to full morning. Grace checked on the injured man near the barn. Dead, she discovered with a sick lurch of her stomach, and the crawler, Bridger, who'd managed to drag himself onto his horse and disappear, leaving a blood trail that headed toward town. She should have felt something about the dead man. Guilt, horror, something. But all she felt was grim satisfaction. They'd come to hurt her family. They'd gotten what they deserved. Grace was washing blood off her hands when she heard more hoofbeats. She grabbed the rifle, positioned herself at the window, ready to finish what Luke had started if Thornton's men came back. But it wasn't Thornton's men. It was David Chen, the Reverend Morrison, and a man Grace didn't recognize, tall, lean, with a silver star pinned to his vest and the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades enforcing law in hard places. "Grace!" David called out. "Don't shoot! We're here to help!" Grace set down the rifle and opened the door, and David took one look at her blood-stained dress and paled. "My God, are you hurt?" "Not me, Luke. He's been shot." Grace's voice cracked. "There was a fight. Thornton's men came." "We know," the stranger said, stepping forward. "I'm Marshal Robert Hayes, ma'am. We heard gunfire from the Chen place, rode hard as we could." His eyes scanned the scene, the dead man by the barn, the blood, the bullet holes. "How many were there?" 6. Luke fought them off. 3 down, 3 fled. Grace swayed suddenly, the adrenaline that had kept her upright finally draining away. David caught her arm. "Luke's inside. He needs a doctor. Please." "Reverend, ride back to town and fetch Doc Patterson," the marshal ordered. "Tell him it's urgent. And tell Sheriff Daniels I want him out here immediately with a full report on his investigation into the Whitmore murder. If he's not here within the hour, I'll arrest him for obstruction of justice." The Reverend rode off fast, and the marshal turned to Grace with kind but firm eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." So Grace told him, all of it. Thomas's murder, Thornton's harassment, the barn sabotage, Bridger's drunken confession, the threats, this morning's attack. She laid it all out while the marshal took notes, and his expression grew progressively darker. "And you can prove all this?" he asked. "I have written documentation of every incident, signed statements from witnesses, and now you have a dead body and evidence of an armed assault on my property." Grace's voice was steel despite her exhaustion. "Marshal, Jack Thornton ordered my husband's murder and has been systematically terrorizing me to force me off my land. If you can't see that, then the law is even more corrupt than I feared." Hayes looked at her with something like respect. Ma'am, I see it just fine. Question is whether I can make it stick in a courtroom. Men like Thornton are slippery. They insulate themselves, use intermediaries, make sure nothing leads back to them directly. Bridger's wounded, Grace said. If you find him before he dies or runs, you might be able to get him to turn on Thornton in exchange for leniency. Smart thinking. Hayes glanced at David. Mr. Chen, you know this territory better than I do. Where would a wounded man go to ground? Thornton's ranch would be the obvious choice, but if Bridger thinks he's failed, he might worry Thornton will tie up loose ends permanently. David considered. There's an old line shack about 5 miles west of here. Abandoned for years, but it's got walls and a roof. If I was hurt and scared, that's where I'd go. Show me, Hayes said. He turned to Grace. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to stay here with Mr. Carver. The doctor should arrive soon. If anyone else comes, anyone, you defend this property with deadly force if necessary. You have that right under territorial law. Grace nodded, clutching the rifle. Marshal, when you find Bridger, tell him... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Tell him he has one chance to do the right thing, one chance to speak truth and maybe save his soul. After that, justice will take its course. Hayes tipped his hat to her. Yes, ma'am, I'll tell him. They rode off, leaving Grace alone with Clara and an unconscious Luke. She sat beside the bed, holding Luke's hand, willing him to wake up, to be all right, to stay with her. You promised, she whispered. You promised we'd survive this together. So you better keep that promise, Cowboy. Because Clara and I need you. I need you. As if he'd heard her, Luke's eyes fluttered open. They were hazy with pain but focused on her face with an intensity that made her heart clench. Grace, he rasped, are you hurt? I'm fine, we're fine. Luke, don't try to talk. Have to, he interrupted, his hand tightening on hers with surprising strength. In case, don't, Grace said fiercely. Don't you dare talk like that. The doctor's coming, the marshal's gone after Bridger, and you're going to be fine. Listen, Luke insisted. If something happens to me, there's money in my saddlebag. Not much, but enough to get you and Clara somewhere safe. And there's a letter addressed to my sister. I want it buried with me, so she knows I never forgot her. Tears streamed down Grace's face. Luke, please. I love you, he said, and his voice was getting weaker. You and Clara, you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. You gave me home, family, purpose. Whatever happens, I want you to know. These past weeks with you have been worth everything, worth every year of running, every loss, every mistake. It all led me to you, and that makes it all worthwhile. Then stay, Grace begged. Stay and have a lifetime of it. Not just weeks, years, Luke, decades. Stay and watch Clara grow up. Stay and build that house with me. Stay and grow old beside me. Please. Luke smiled weakly. Bossy woman. You love that about me. I do, he agreed. His eyes were drifting closed again. Grace, I'm tired. Then rest, she said, stroking his hair. Rest and heal. I'll be right here when you wake up. She sat there, keeping vigil, until Doc Patterson arrived an hour later. He examined Luke with practiced efficiency, cleaning and re-bandaging the wound, checking for signs of infection or internal bleeding. He's strong, the doctor said finally. Lost a good amount of blood, but nothing vital was hit. With rest and proper care, he should recover fully, though I'd recommend he avoid getting shot again in the near future. Grace laughed despite herself, a slightly hysterical sound. I'll make sure to tell him that when he wakes up. The doctor left her with instructions and medicine, and Grace settled in for a long wait. Clara needed feeding and changing, the animals needed tending, and there was a dead body in her yard that would need dealing with eventually. But for now, she just sat beside Luke and held his hand. It was late afternoon when the marshal returned, and Grace could tell immediately from his expression that something significant had happened. We found Bridger, Hayes said without preamble. He was at that line shack, half dead from blood loss. Knew he wasn't going to make it, and I think he was scared of dying with all that sin on his soul. The marshal pulled out a folded document. He confessed everything, Mrs. Whitmore. Every detail about your husband's murder, about the other crimes Thornton ordered, about how it all worked. He signed a full confession before witnesses. Grace felt her knees go weak. He confessed? To killing Thomas? To being part of the group that did, yes. Said Thornton paid them each $100 to make it look like rustlers. They were supposed to scare your husband off, but Thomas fought back, tried to reach for a rifle, and Bridger panicked and shot him. Hayes's expression was grave. Ma'am, I'm sorry you had to go through all this, but Tom Bridger died about 2 hours ago, and before he did, he made sure justice would be served. What about Thornton? Grace asked, her voice hollow. I arrested him an hour ago. He's in custody, awaiting trial for conspiracy to commit murder, among other charges. With Bridger's confession and all the evidence you've gathered, the territorial prosecutor says we have more than enough for a conviction. Hayes paused. It's over, Mrs. Whitmore. Jack Thornton will hang for what he did to your husband. Grace sat down hard on the porch steps, and suddenly she was sobbing, huge, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep inside her. All the grief she'd been holding back, all the fear and anger and desperation, it all came pouring out in a flood she couldn't control. The marshal stood awkwardly by until the storm passed. When Grace could finally speak again, she looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for believing me. Thank you for doing what was right. That's the job, ma'am, Hayes said simply. Though I'll admit, cases like this are why I still wear the badge after all these years. Sometimes the good people win. Not often enough, but sometimes. He left after giving Grace information about the trial, about what to expect, about resources available to her. Grace sat on the porch for a long time after he rode away, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. It was imperfect and fragile, born from violence and grief, but it was real. Thomas would have justice. Thornton would pay for his crimes, and Grace and Clara could finally move forward without looking over their shoulders. Luke woke up 2 days later, fever-free and clear-eyed. Grace was dozing in the chair beside the bed when she felt him squeeze her hand. Grace, he said, and his voice was rough from disuse but wonderfully beautifully alive. She was on her feet instantly, checking his forehead, examining the wound, making sure he was really, truly all right. How do you feel? Like I got shot, Luke said with a weak grin. But alive. Grace, what happened? Did Thornton's men come back? Are you and Clara? We're safe, Grace assured him, settling back into the chair and taking his hand. Luke, it's over. The marshal found Bridger, got a full confession before he died. Thornton's in jail awaiting trial for Thomas's murder. It's over. Luke stared at her, processing this information. Over, he repeated slowly. Grace, that means we're safe, Grace finished. That means we can actually live our lives instead of just surviving. That means we can have the future you talked about. The future where I marry you, Luke said, and despite his weakened condition, his eyes were intense. Grace, I know I'm in no condition to get down on one knee right now, but I'm asking anyway. Will you marry me? Will you let me be a husband to you and a father to Clara? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a broken-down drifter who didn't know how to stay put until you taught him? Grace laughed through fresh tears. That's the worst proposal I've ever heard. It's the only one I've got, Luke said. So what's your answer? Yes, Grace said, leaning down to kiss him gently. Yes, 1,000 times yes, on one condition. Name it. You stop calling yourself broken. You're not broken, Luke Carver. You're healing. We both are. Together. Luke pulled her down beside him on the bed, careful of his injured side, and held her close. Together, he agreed. I like the sound of that. They were married 6 weeks later, on a crisp October morning when the leaves were turning gold and the air smelled of autumn and new beginnings. Luke had recovered fully, though he moved a bit stiffly still and probably would for the rest of his life. Grace wore her blue calico dress with wildflowers in her hair that Sarah Chen had helped her pick that morning. Clara, now 8 months old and thriving, wore a new white dress that Martha Henderson had sewn as a gift. The wedding took place in the small church in Cedar Creek with what felt like the entire town in attendance. Not because they all approved. Grace knew the gossips would always whisper about the widow who'd married so quickly after her husband's death, but because they were curious, and because Grace and Luke had become something of legends after their stand against Thornton. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, speaking about love that emerges from darkness, about second chances, about the courage it takes to open your heart after loss. Do you, Luke Carver, take Grace Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Luke looked at Grace with those storm-gray eyes that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection, and said clearly, "I do." "And do you, Grace Whitmore, take Luke Carver to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Grace thought about Thomas, about the life they'd planned together, about the love they'd shared. She thought about grief and survival, and the unexpected way life could surprise you with joy when you'd given up hope of ever feeling it again. "I do," she said. Luke had bought her a ring, simple silver with a small turquoise stone, using money from odd jobs he'd taken while recovering. When he slipped it onto her finger, his hands were steady and sure. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Morrison declared with a broad smile. "Luke, you may kiss your bride." And Luke did, thoroughly and sweetly, while the congregation applauded and Clara babbled happily from Sarah Chen's arms. The reception was held at the Chen Ranch, where tables had been set up under the open sky and neighbors had contributed food for a proper feast. There was music and dancing, laughter and joy, and for a few hours Grace let herself forget about everything except the feel of Luke's arms around her as they swayed to fiddle music under the stars. "Happy?" Luke murmured against her ear. "Deliriously," Grace replied. "You?" "More than I ever thought possible." He pulled back to look at her. "Grace Carver. Has a nice ring to it." "It does," she agreed, "though I think I'll keep using Whitmore for legal things, for Clara's sake, so she knows where she came from." "That's good," Luke said. "She should know about Thomas, know he was a good man who loved her. When she's old enough, we'll tell her everything." "We," Grace repeated, savoring the word. "I love that we're a we now." "We've been a we since the day I rode up to your porch with that milk cow," Luke pointed out. "This just makes it official." They danced until Clara got fussy and needed feeding, then they said their goodbyes and rode home through the darkness. Home to the homestead that was truly theirs now, no longer shadowed by Thornton's threat. Over the following months, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost miraculous in its normalcy. Luke officially adopted Clara, giving her his name alongside Whitmore, making her Clara Whitmore Carver, a bridge between the past and the future. They expanded the homestead, buying 3 more cows with money from the sale of some of Thornton's confiscated property that had been awarded to Grace as partial restitution. Luke built the new chicken coop they'd planned, repaired the barn properly, and started laying the foundation for the bigger house. Thornton's trial was held in November, and Grace testified about everything she'd endured. It was hard, reliving those dark days, but Luke sat in the courtroom beside her, his presence an anchor that kept her steady. Thornton was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to hang. Grace thought she'd feel satisfaction when the verdict was read, but instead she just felt tired. Justice didn't bring Thomas back. It didn't erase the suffering, but it did mean no one else would be hurt by Jack Thornton's greed and cruelty, and that was something. Winter came, and this time Grace faced it with plenty of supplies, a full root cellar, warm blankets, and most importantly, she didn't face it alone. Luke was there through every cold night, every snowstorm, every challenge. He taught Clara to take her first steps in the middle of a February blizzard, catching her when she stumbled and spinning her around until she shrieked with laughter. "She's going to be a heartbreaker," Luke said, watching Clara toddle around the kitchen with more confidence each day. "We're going to have to beat the suitors away with a stick." "That's years away," Grace protested, but she was smiling. "Right now, she's just our baby." "Our baby," Luke repeated, and Grace heard the wonder in his voice. He still sometimes seemed amazed that this was his life, that he had a wife, a daughter, a home. "Grace, I need to tell you something." The serious tone made Grace look up from the bread she was kneading. "What is it?" Luke pulled a folded letter from his pocket, old and worn, clearly read many times. "Remember I told you about the letter I wrote to Emma, the one I wanted buried with me if I died?" Grace nodded, her throat tight. I read it again last night after Clara went to sleep, and I realized something. Luke unfolded the letter carefully. I wrote this 5 years ago after a particularly bad night where the guilt was eating me alive. I wrote down everything I wished I could say to her, all the apologies, all the regrets, and at the end I wrote, "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for failing you." He looked up at Grace. "But Grace, I don't think that's what Emma would have wanted. I don't think she'd want me spending my whole life in penance, trying to atone for something that wasn't really my fault. I think she'd want me to live, to be happy, to have the kind of family we never got to be." Grace set down her dough and came to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I think you're right. So I'm going to bury the letter," Luke said, "properly, at her grave in Colorado. I've been saving money, and come spring, I want us to make the trip, all three of us. I want to introduce you and Clara to my sister. Tell her about the life I've built, the love I've found. And then I want to say goodbye, not to her memory, but to the guilt, to the running, to the man I was before you." Grace felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "Luke, that's beautiful. Yes, we'll go. We'll go together." They made the trip in April, when the weather had warmed and the trails were passable. It took 2 weeks of hard riding, camping under the stars, fording rivers swollen with snowmelt. Clara thought it was a grand adventure, babbling excitedly at every new sight, charming everyone they met along the way. They found Emma's grave in a small cemetery outside Denver, marked by a simple wooden cross that had weathered 15 years of elements. Luke stood there for a long time, just staring, while Grace hung back with Clara, giving him space. Finally, he knelt down, and Grace saw him dig a small hole at the base of the cross. He placed the letter inside, covered it with earth, then sat back on his heels. Grace couldn't hear what he said, but she saw his lips moving, saw the tears on his cheeks, saw the way his shoulders finally relaxed. As if he'd been carrying a weight for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. When he came back to them, his eyes were red but clear. "I told her about you, but," he said, "about how you saved me the way I couldn't save her. About Clara, about the homestead, about everything we're building. And I said goodbye." Grace took his hand. "How do you feel?" Luke considered the question seriously. "Free," he said finally. "For the first time in 15 years, I feel free." They stayed in Denver for a few days, letting the horses rest, stocking up on supplies. Luke was quiet, but not sad, more thoughtful than anything, and Grace could see him processing, healing, letting go of the past piece by piece. On their last night in the city, they sat in their hotel room while Clara slept, and Luke said, "I want to have more children. With you, if you're willing." Grace felt warmth bloom in her chest. "I'm willing. How many are you thinking? 3 or 4? Maybe 5? Luke grinned at her expression. "We've got a big house to build. Might as well fill it up." "You're crazy," Grace said, but she was laughing. "But all right, 3 or 4 sounds perfect." "Grace," Luke said, suddenly serious, "I know this all happened fast. I know people judge us for it, but I need you to know I don't regret a single moment, not one. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." "Even better than that time you won $50 in a poker game in New Mexico?" Grace teased. "Even better than that," Luke confirmed solemnly. "Though that was a pretty good day." They made love that night with a tenderness that spoke of deep understanding, of two people who'd found each other against all odds and refused to let go. And when Grace fell asleep in Luke's arms, she dreamed not of the past, but of the future, of the children they'd have, the life they'd build, the years stretching ahead full of possibility. They returned home in May to find their garden already sprouting from seeds the Chens had planted in their absence, their animals healthy and well-tended by neighbors, and a letter waiting from the territorial governor's office. Grace opened it with trembling hands and read that she'd been awarded full title to her land, with all Thornton's claims invalidated, plus additional compensation for her suffering. "We're really going to be all right," she said wonderingly. "Luke, we're going to make it." "Never doubted it for a second," Luke lied, and they both laughed. The years that followed were everything Luke had promised that first night on the porch. They built the big house, 4 bedrooms, a proper parlor, a kitchen twice the size of the original. Clara grew into a bright, confident girl who could ride before she could read and who had her father's eyes and her mother's determination. They had 3 more children, James Luke Carver, born during a thunderstorm 2 years after the wedding; Sarah Grace Carver, named for the friend who'd stood by them, born on a spring morning when the wildflowers were blooming; and Thomas David Carver, named for both men who'd shaped their family's story, born during the first snow of an early winter. Luke never drifted again. He became a fixture in Cedar Creek, known as an honest man, a good neighbor, someone who'd help anyone who needed it. He taught his children everything he knew about ranching, about surviving on the frontier, about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Grace thrived in ways she'd never imagined possible. The homestead expanded into a proper ranch, one of the most successful in the territory. She became known as a businesswoman who could negotiate with cattle buyers and hold her own in any deal. But more than that, she became known as someone who'd survived the impossible and built something beautiful from the ashes. On their 10th anniversary, Luke took Grace back to the spot where he'd first ridden up with that milk cow, and they stood there watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you remember what I said that first day?" Luke asked. "About how sometimes a small kindness is the difference between life and the alternative?" "I remember," Grace said. "I was wrong," Luke said. "It wasn't a small kindness. What we gave each other, it was everything. You gave me a reason to live, Grace. A reason to stop running. A home." Grace leaned against him, his arm around her waist, and looked out at the land they'd fought for, the house they'd built, the children playing in the yard under the watchful eye of their oldest daughter, Clara, now a young woman of 14. "You gave me the same thing," she said quietly. "After Thomas died, I thought my life was over. I thought the best I could hope for was survival. But Luke, you taught me that life after loss is possible, that loving again doesn't diminish what came before, that joy can grow in the darkest soil." "We taught each other," Luke corrected. "Everything good in my life exists because a stubborn widow refused to give up, and I was lucky enough to ride by at the right time." "The right stranger at the right time," Grace agreed, echoing his words from that first day. They stood there until the stars came out, 2 people who'd been broken and alone, now whole and together, watching their children's laughter echo across the land they'd claimed through courage and love. And Grace thought about prayers answered not by miracles, but by the right person arriving exactly when they're needed. Thought about how the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures. Thought about how love, real love, doesn't follow timelines or social conventions. It simply is, powerful and true, reshaping everything it touches. Clara Whitmore Carver grew up and married a young rancher from the next county over, giving Grace and Luke their first grandchildren. James took over the ranch when Luke finally decided to slow down in his 60s. Sarah became a teacher, bringing education to frontier children who'd otherwise go without. And Thomas Jr. became a lawyer, fighting for justice in cases that reminded Grace painfully and proudly of everything they'd endured. Luke and Grace grew old together on the porch of that big house, watching sunsets and remembering. Sometimes they talked about those early days, about the drought, about Thornton, about how close they'd come to losing everything. But more often, they talked about the future, about their grandchildren, about the life they'd built that neither had imagined possible. On a warm evening in their 35th year of marriage, Luke took Grace's hand, weathered now, marked by years of hard work and harder-won joy, and said, "If I could go back and change anything, you know what I'd change." "What?" Grace asked. "Nothing," Luke said simply. "Every moment, every hardship, every loss. It all led me here. To you. And Grace, you've made my life worth living. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." Grace felt tears slide down her wrinkled cheeks, but they were happy tears. "I love you too, Cowboy. You brought milk and a marriage proposal, and you gave me everything." "You gave me everything," Luke corrected. "You gave me home." They sat there as the Texas sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. Hands joined as they had been since that first desperate night when a drifter and a widow found salvation in each other. And if you'd asked either of them what they believed in, they'd tell you the same thing. They believed in second chances. They believed in love that emerges from ashes. They believed that sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations. But most of all, they believed in each other, then, now, and forever. And that, Grace would say if anyone asked, was more than enough. It was everything. The end.